The great hall of Blackstone Keep had never been this silent. Hundreds of pack members stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the iron chandeliers, and not one of them dared to breathe too loudly. Elena Voss stood in the center of the stone floor, her hands folded in front of her, her chin lifted, while Alpha King Cassian Blackwood stared down at her from the raised dais as if she were something he had scraped off his boot. "You are not fit to stand beside me," Cassian said. His voice carried across the hall without effort, the voice of a man who had never once been told no. "You have no rank, no strength, no wolf worth speaking of. I reject you, Elena Voss, as my mate, in front of this entire kingdom." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, a woman covered her mouth. An old man shook his head slowly, as if he had seen cruelty like this before, and knew exactly how it would end. Elena did not gasp. She did not cry. She did not sink to her knees the way every instinct in the room expected her to. She smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a broken smile pretending to be brave. It was cold, precise, and utterly calm. The kind of smile that made the hair on the back of Cassian's neck rise, though he could not have explained why. For one heartbeat, the great Alpha King felt something he had not felt in 10 years of ruling this kingdom. He felt uncertain. "Understood, Your Majesty," Elena said. Her voice was quiet, but it reached every corner of the hall. "Thank you for making that so clear, in front of everyone." Then she turned, and she walked out. She did not run. She did not stumble. Her footsteps were even and unhurried, echoing off the stone floor with a steadiness that unsettled the crowd more than tears ever could have. The great oak doors of the hall swung open before her, as though the very keep itself wanted her gone, and then they closed behind her with a heavy, final sound. Cassian remained on the dais, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the doors long after she had disappeared through them. Around him, whispers began to spread like smoke through dry grass. He ignored them. He had done what needed to be done. A king could not be tied to a woman who carried no strength, no title, no wolf blood worth mentioning. His advisors had told him so for months. His father, before his death, had warned him never to let sentiment weaken the throne. Elena Voss had been a mistake of fate, a mate bond that had formed with the wrong person, and now it was corrected. That was what he told himself as he descended from the dais and walked toward his private chambers. That was what he told himself as the sun set over Blackstone Keep and the halls slowly emptied. That was what he told himself as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the relief that was supposed to come with cutting away something so obviously beneath him. The relief did not come. Instead, there was a strange hollow feeling in his chest, a small ache just beneath his ribs, faint but persistent, like a splinter lodged too deep to see. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a king did not feel regret over discarding weakness. He was wrong, though he would not admit it for a long time. 3 days passed. On the 4th morning, Cassian summoned his beta, a broad-shouldered man named Damon Ashcroft who had served the Blackwood family since Cassian was a boy, learning to walk on 2 legs before he ever learned to run on 4. "Send for Elena Voss," Cassian said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "I want to see if she has come to her senses. If she wishes to remain in the territory in some lesser role, I am willing to allow it, provided she understands her place." Damon shifted uncomfortably by the door. "Your Majesty, that may be difficult." Cassian finally looked up. "Difficult how? She has nowhere else to go. Her family holds no land, no influence. She should be grateful I am even willing to offer her shelter." "She is gone, Your Majesty." The words hung in the air for a long moment. Cassian set down his pen with deliberate slowness. "Gone where?" "No one knows," Damon admitted. "Her chambers were empty by morning, the night after the ceremony. Her clothes, her belongings, everything is gone. The guards at the gate saw nothing. The trackers found no scent, trail past the eastern woods, and even that fades strangely, as if she knew exactly how to disappear." Cassian rose from his chair so fast it scraped loudly against the stone floor. "That is impossible. She is human. She has no training, no resources, no protection. A human woman does not simply vanish from a guarded keep without a trace." "That is what troubles me as well, Your Majesty," Damon said carefully. For a long moment, Cassian said nothing. He walked to the window of his study, looking out over the vast territory that stretched beyond Blackstone Keep. forests and hills and rivers that belonged to him by blood and by strength. Somewhere out there, a woman he had publicly humiliated in front of his entire kingdom had disappeared like smoke, and he found himself unable to explain the tightness building in his chest. "Find her," he said finally, his voice low. "I do not care what it takes. Find her and bring her back so I can be certain she is safe. That is all. Nothing more." Daemon did not believe him, though he was wise enough not to say so. What Cassian did not know, what no one in his kingdom knew, was that Elena Voss had never been the fragile, powerless woman she appeared to be. 2 years earlier, in a territory far to the east, a young woman named Elena had watched her own father, Alpha Julian Voss, fall in a war he did not start. A war fought over land and pride, between two powerful bloodlines. In the chaos that followed his death, Elena had made a choice that few would have had the courage to make. She erased her name from every record she could reach. She dyed her hair, changed her manner of speaking, and traveled far from her home territory, presenting herself to the world as nothing more than an ordinary human woman, with no family, no wolf, and no claim to anything. She did this because the moment word spread that Julian Voss's daughter still lived, every enemy of her father's bloodline would come looking for her, and she was not yet strong enough to face them. So she waited. She trained in secret, in the early hours before dawn and the late hours after midnight, teaching herself control over a wolf she had hidden from the world so completely that even she sometimes forgot how powerful it truly was. She studied old texts on pack law and territory rights, on the subtle games played between alpha families, on the kind of patience that outlasts anger. She built alliances quietly, through letters signed with false names, through favors offered without explanation, through a network of trust so carefully constructed that not even her closest companions understood its full shape. And then, through a twist of fate she had not planned, the mate bond had formed between her and Cassian Blackwood, king of one of the largest territories in the region. At first, she had wondered if this was an opportunity, a chance to rebuild strength, and standing through an alliance no one would question. She had gone to Blackstone Keep with an open mind, willing to see if something real might grow between them. What she found instead was a man convinced of his own superiority, surrounded by advisors who whispered that mate bonds were beneath a king of his stature, that true power came from strategic marriage, not fate's careless matching. She watched him grow colder toward her with each passing month, watched him begin to believe the poison his advisors fed him, until the night he stood before his entire kingdom and rejected her as though she were nothing. She had known it was coming. She had felt it building for weeks. And so, when the moment finally arrived, she was not broken by it. She was, in a strange and quiet way, relieved. Because now she was free to become who she truly was. That night, while Cassian lay awake in his chambers wondering at the hollow feeling in his chest, Elena moved swiftly and silently through the eastern woods that bordered his territory. She did not run in panic. She moved with the precision of someone who had planned this moment for a very long time, following paths only she knew, avoiding the trackers Cassian had not yet thought to send. By dawn, she had crossed into neutral territory, where a small group of riders waited for her, exactly where she had arranged, months earlier, through careful letters and trusted intermediaries. "You are certain about this," said a woman among the riders, a sharp-eyed companion named Priscilla Vane, who had served Elena's family since before the war. "Once you step back into the world as who you truly are, there is no returning to hiding." Elena looked back once, toward the direction of Blackstone Keep, now far behind her and growing smaller with every passing moment. "I have been hiding for 2 years, Priscilla," she said. "I am done." She mounted the horse offered to her, and as the first light of morning broke over the hills, Elena Voss, daughter of the fallen Alpha Julian Voss, rightful heir to a bloodline that many believed had ended in the ashes of a war years ago, rode east, toward a life that belonged entirely to her. Behind her, in Blackstone Keep, Cassian Blackwood stood at his window for a third straight night, staring out at the darkness, unable to shake the feeling that he had made a mistake far larger than he understood. He told himself it was pride. He told himself it was simply the unfamiliar sting of being defied by someone he had expected to break easily. He did not yet understand that he had rejected the one person capable of matching him in strength, in will, and in the quiet, dangerous patience of someone who has already survived losing everything once before. He would understand eventually. But by then, Elena Voss would no longer be the woman waiting for his approval. She would be someone else entirely, someone rebuilding a kingdom of her own, someone who had learned that the coldest smile in the world is not born from cruelty, but from the moment a person finally stops needing anyone else's permission to survive. The search parties Cassian sent out over the following days returned again and again with nothing. No scent, no sightings, no trace of a woman who, by every account, should have had nowhere to go and no way to disappear so completely. Damon Ashcroft grew increasingly uneasy, watching his king pace the halls of Blackstone Keep at odd hours, watching him snap at advisors who dared suggest that perhaps the search should be called off. "She is human," one advisor had made the mistake of saying. "Perhaps it is best to let her go, Your Majesty. There are more suitable matches to consider for the future of the kingdom." Cassian had turned on him with such sudden fury that the man had stumbled backward into a table, sending a stack of papers scattering across the floor. "She is not simply gone," Cassian said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you understand what that means? A human woman, alone, without training, without allies, vanished from a guarded keep, without leaving a single trace, for my best trackers to follow. Either something has happened to her that none of us wish to consider, or everything I believed about her was wrong." He did not say which possibility frightened him more. By the end of the first week, the search parties had exhausted every lead within 100 miles of Blackstone Keep. The trail, wherever it had once existed, had gone completely cold. Cassian retreated into his study, refusing most visitors, staring for long hours at nothing in particular, the hollow ache in his chest growing sharper instead of fading as the days went on. He told himself, again and again, that this was simply the natural discomfort of an unresolved matter, a loose thread in an otherwise well-ordered kingdom. He did not yet understand that the mate bond he had so carelessly severed did not disappear simply because he willed it to. He did not yet understand that somewhere far to the east, a woman with a cold smile and a fire he had never bothered to notice was building something far greater than the shelter he had once grudgingly offered her. He would understand, in time. For now, all he had was an empty bed, a silent hall that still seemed to echo with the sound of her even footsteps walking away, and the growing, unwelcome realization that the woman he had dismissed as unworthy might be the only person in his kingdom who had never once feared him. There was one detail Cassian did not share with his advisors, one moment from the night of the rejection that he kept locked away, turning it over in his mind whenever the halls fell quiet. As Elena had turned to leave the great hall, just before the doors swung open before her, she had looked at him. It lasted less than a second, barely long enough for anyone else in the crowded hall to notice. But Cassian had seen it, and he could not stop seeing it in the days that followed. There had been no hatred in her eyes, no plea for him to reconsider, no flicker of the heartbreak he had expected to find and had, in some dark corner of himself, wanted to find, because heartbreak would have confirmed everything he believed about her weakness. Instead, there had been something far more unsettling, a kind of quiet recognition, as though she had known this moment was coming, long before he ever raised his voice to reject her, as though she had already grieved whatever there was to grieve, long before he ever gave the words a shape. It was the look of someone who had already decided, in her own heart, exactly what she was going to do next. He thought about that look constantly. He thought about it while reviewing reports on the northern border, where a smaller pack had recently begun testing the edges of his territory with increasing boldness. He thought about it during council meetings, where his advisors argued over trade routes and grain stores, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. He thought about it late at night, alone in his chambers, in the bed that had once, briefly, held the promise of two people learning to become a pair, and now held only him and the cold, empty space beside him. Sleep did not come easily anymore. When it did come, it was thin and restless, filled with half-formed images he could not quite hold on to by morning, images that always seemed to involve a woman walking calmly away from him, through some vast, dark distance he could never quite close. He began to notice, too, a strange weakening in himself that he could not explain to his physicians, who found nothing wrong when they examined him. His temper, always sharp, grew sharper still, flaring at the smallest provocations. His control over his own shift, once effortless, now occasionally slipped, the wolf beneath his skin restless and agitated, in a way it had never been before. He caught himself, more than once, standing at the edge of the training grounds, staring toward the eastern horizon, without any memory of walking there. Daemon noticed these changes before anyone else dared to mention them. "Your Majesty," he said one evening, finding Cassian alone in the study long after the rest of the keep had gone quiet. "Forgive me for speaking plainly, but you are not yourself. The pack has noticed. Some of the younger wolves have begun to whisper that something is wrong with the bond that ties the pack together, that the king's own unrest is beginning to unsettle the rest of us." Cassian did not look up from the papers he was pretending to read. "The pack should focus on their duties, not on gossip. With respect, Your Majesty, a king's state affects the whole pack, whether we wish it to or not. That is simply how the bond works. It has always worked that way, long before either of us was born." Cassian set down the papers at last, rubbing a hand over his face, suddenly looking older and more tired than Daemon had ever seen him. "What would you have me do, Daemon? Chase after a woman who clearly wants nothing more to do with me? Admit, in front of the entire kingdom, that I made an error in judgment? I would have you consider," Daemon said carefully, "that perhaps the error was not in choosing her as your mate. Perhaps the error was in how you let her go." Cassian said nothing to that. There was nothing he could say that would not feel, in some way, like an admission he was not yet ready to make. That night, he dreamed again of the eastern woods, of a trail that led nowhere, of a woman's calm, even footsteps fading into silence. When he woke, the ache beneath his ribs had not lessened. If anything, it had grown, a slow and steady reminder that something essential had been torn loose from him the moment those great oak doors closed behind Elena Voss, and no amount of pride or denial was going to put it back the way it had been. Far to the east, in a modest but well-guarded manor that Elena had quietly purchased under a different name, months before the rejection ever took place, she sat by a window, overlooking a garden she had planted herself, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something close to peace. She did not think of Cassian often. When she did, it was not with anger, and it was not with longing. It was with a kind of distant curiosity, the way one might think of weather in a country one no longer lived in. She had work to do, alliances to rebuild, a name to reclaim, carefully and on her own terms, when the time was right. She rose from the window, straightened the sleeves of her plain traveling dress, and walked out to meet the small council of advisors gathering in the manor's main hall, people who had followed her father once, and now, slowly, quietly, were beginning to follow her. Whatever Cassian Blackwood was feeling in his cold, silent keep, it was no longer her concern. She had a kingdom of her own to build. The council that gathered in Elena's manor that evening was small, no more than a dozen people, but each one had been chosen with great care. There was Priscilla Vane, sharp-eyed and loyal beyond question, who had once served as a healer in her father's court, and now managed the manor's affairs with quiet efficiency. There was an older man named Edmund Cole, a former strategist of the Voss bloodline, who had spent the last 2 years believing his old Alpha's daughter had died alongside her father, only to receive a letter 6 months ago that changed everything he thought he knew. There was a younger wolf named Felix Marlowe, barely into his 20s, whose family had once owed a debt to the Voss line, and who had pledged himself to Elena's cause the moment he learned she still lived. "The northern packs are still unstable," Edmund said, spreading a map across the long wooden table at the center of the hall. "Since your father's death, 3 smaller territories have fallen under the influence of Alpha Garrick Thorne, who has made no secret of his ambition to claim the old Voss lands for himself." Elena studied the map in silence for a long moment, her finger tracing the borders that had once belonged to her family, now carved up and scattered among rival claims. "And Blackstone Keep? Has there been any word?" "Only that the king has doubled his search efforts," Priscilla said carefully, watching Elena's face for any reaction. "He seems determined to find you." "He will not," Elena said simply, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only certainty. "By the time he understands who he truly rejected, I intend to be far beyond anything he can reach." Felix leaned forward, curiosity written plainly across his young face. "Forgive me for asking, but do you not feel anything, knowing he searches for you? Anger, perhaps? Some small satisfaction?" Elena considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things, weighing it before she answered. I felt many things, the night he rejected me in front of his entire kingdom. I will not pretend otherwise. But I have learned something in the 2 years since my father died, something I think all of you have learned as well, in your own ways. Grief and anger are useful for exactly as long as it takes to understand what they are trying to tell you, and no longer than that. After that, they become weight you carry, for no reason. She rolled up the map and looked around the table at the small group who had chosen to follow her, not out of obligation, but out of belief in what she might become. We have work to do, she said. The Northern Territories will not reclaim themselves, and I have no intention of remaining a rumor in someone else's story any longer. Outside the manor windows, the sun had begun to set over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and violet. Somewhere far behind her, in a keep of cold stone and colder pride, a king paced his empty chambers, haunted by a mistake he could not yet name. Elena Voss did not look back toward the west that evening. She had already decided, with the same calm certainty that had carried her out of that great hall days earlier, that her future was hers alone to build, and that whatever Cassian Blackwood chose to do with his regret was, quite simply, no longer her burden to carry. 2 weeks after Elena Voss disappeared from Blackstone Keep, Alpha King Cassian Blackwood stood before his full council for the first time since the rejection ceremony, and the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The northern border has been tested 3 times this month, said Nathaniel Gray, the head of Cassian's military advisors, tapping a weathered finger against the map spread across the council table. Small incursions, nothing our warriors cannot handle, but the pattern is troubling. It is as though someone is testing our response times, watching how quickly we notice, how quickly we react. Who would dare test Blackstone's borders? Asked another advisor, a stern-faced woman named Louisa Fenwick, who had served on the council since before Cassian's father died. Nathaniel hesitated. That is the trouble, Your Majesty. We do not know. Our trackers found signs of a scouting party, well-trained, well-disciplined, moving with a precision that suggests real coordination, but they left almost no trace. Whoever sent them wanted us to notice their presence without learning anything about who they truly were. Cassian said nothing for a long moment, staring at the map without truly seeing it. In the 2 weeks since Elena's disappearance, he had grown thinner, sharper around the edges, like a blade worn down by constant use. The hollow ache beneath his ribs had not faded. If anything, it had settled into something closer to a permanent companion, a low and steady reminder that something in him remained unfinished. Increase patrols along the northern border, he said finally. Double the watch at night. I want to know who is testing us, and I want to know soon. The council meeting continued for another hour, discussing grain stores and trade agreements, and a dispute between 2 smaller packs within Blackstone's territory. But Cassian found it difficult to focus on any of it. His mind kept drifting back to the same unanswered question that had haunted him since the night of the rejection. Where had Elena Voss learned to disappear so completely? He had asked himself the question 100 times, and every answer he came up with only raised further questions. A human woman with no training should not have been able to vanish from a guarded keep without leaving a single trace. She should not have been able to avoid his trackers, avoid every search party he sent out, avoid every net he cast across the surrounding territories. Unless she was not, in fact, simply a human woman with no training. The thought had occurred to him before, late at night when sleep would not come, but he had always dismissed it as the desperate reasoning of a man unwilling to accept that he had been wrong about someone. Now, sitting in his council chamber while his advisors argued over grain shipments, the thought returned with new weight. After the meeting ended, Cassian remained behind, staring at the map long after the others had filed out. Damon Ashcroft lingered near the door, watching his king, with the careful patience of someone who had served him long enough to know when silence needed to be respected, and when it needed to be broken. You are thinking about her again, Damon said eventually. Cassian did not bother denying it. Tell me honestly, Damon, when you searched for her, what did you find? Not the official report. What did you actually see? Damon considered the question carefully before answering. The trail vanished at the edge of the eastern woods, Your Majesty, not faded, as a trail naturally fades over time and distance. It stopped, entirely, as though someone had known exactly how to erase it. Our best trackers said they had never seen anything like it. One of them, an older wolf who has tracked for 30 years, said it reminded him of the kind of trail erasure taught to trained scouts, the sort used by packs who valued secrecy above all else. Cassian's jaw tightened. You never mentioned this in your reports. Because I did not want to alarm you with speculation, Your Majesty, and because I was not certain what it meant. Daemon paused, choosing his next words with obvious care. But I have wondered, in the weeks since, whether Elena Voss was ever truly the woman we believed her to be. The words hung in the air between them, echoing the exact thought that had been circling in Cassian's own mind for days. If she was hiding something, Cassian said slowly, then everything I said to her that night, everything I believed about her weakness, her unworthiness, all of it was built on a lie she allowed us to believe. Or a truth she was forced to hide, for reasons we do not yet understand, Daemon offered. Your Majesty, if I may speak plainly, the woman who walked out of that hall without a single tear, who vanished without a trace, despite having every reason to be afraid, does not sound like someone without strength. She sounds like someone who has survived far worse than a king's rejection, and simply chose not to let it break her in front of an audience that did not deserve to see it. Cassian looked up sharply at that, something shifting behind his eyes. It was the first time anyone in his court had suggested, even indirectly, that Elena's calm departure had not been weakness disguised as composure, but something else entirely. Strength that he had simply failed to recognize. Over the following days, Cassian found himself returning to that conversation, again and again. He began quietly reviewing old records, searching for any mention of a woman named Elena Voss before she arrived at Blackstone Keep 2 years earlier, as a mate candidate presented through a distant matchmaking arrangement. What he found, or rather, what he failed to find, troubled him more than any evidence could have. There was almost nothing, no record of her birth in any nearby territory, no family listed beyond a vague mention of distant relatives who had since passed, no history of her life before the arrangement that had brought her to his court. It was as though she had appeared out of nothing, fully formed, with no past attached to her at all. A person did not simply have no past. Someone had erased it, carefully and thoroughly, and only someone with significant resources and knowledge could have managed such a thing. The realization settled over Cassian like cold water. He had rejected a woman he did not truly know at all, a woman who had clearly spent considerable effort hiding her true identity from him, and from his entire court. The question that followed, the question he could not stop turning over in his mind, was simple and unavoidable. Why would someone go to such lengths to hide who they truly were, unless the truth was something powerful enough to be dangerous? Meanwhile, in the Eastern Territory that Elena now called home, the small council she had assembled continued its careful, patient work of rebuilding what had once belonged to her father. Under Elena's guidance, the manor's modest holdings had begun to expand, quietly absorbing smaller allied territories through careful negotiation rather than force, building a network of loyalty that stretched further with each passing week. Alpha Thorn has grown bold, Edmund Cole reported one evening, spreading fresh intelligence across the council table. He has begun openly claiming that the old Voss bloodline is extinct, using that claim to justify his expansion into territories that should rightfully return to your family's control. Elena studied the report with narrowed eyes. Let him believe what he wishes, for now. The moment I reveal my identity, every ambitious alpha in the region will either seek to ally with me, or seek to eliminate me before I grow too strong to challenge. I intend to be strong enough that the choice is obvious before that moment arrives. And Blackstone Keep? Priscilla asked, watching Elena carefully. Their king continues to search for you. Our contacts within his territory report that he has grown increasingly withdrawn, increasingly obsessed with finding an explanation for your disappearance. Elena's expression did not change, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes. That is not my concern. Cassian Blackwood made his choice in front of his entire kingdom. Whatever consequences follow from that choice belong to him alone. But that night, alone in her chambers, Elena found herself standing by the window for far longer than she intended, looking out at the darkened hills toward the west, toward a keep of cold stone she told herself she had no reason to think about anymore. The mate bond, though severed by rejection, did not simply disappear without leaving some trace behind. She felt it sometimes, A faint and distant pull she refused to acknowledge in front of her council, a whisper of connection that no amount of careful planning had managed to fully silence. She pushed the feeling down, the way she had learned to push down every feeling that threatened to slow her forward momentum, and turned away from the window. There was work to be done, a kingdom to rebuild, and she had no intention of letting old wounds, however faint their remaining pull, determine the shape of her future. Behind her, unseen and unspoken, the bond remained, patient and unbroken despite everything, waiting quietly for the day when two people who had once been meant for each other would find their way back into the same room, whether either of them was ready for it or not. Word of the mysterious rising power in the east reached Blackstone Keep sooner than Elena would have preferred. It arrived not through any careless mistake on her part, but through the natural consequence of expansion, the way a fire cannot grow without eventually being seen. A merchant caravan traveling between territories brought the first rumors, tales of a quiet but formidable young leader who had begun uniting smaller packs along the eastern borders, offering protection and fair trade in exchange for loyalty. The merchants spoke of a council led by someone whose name they did not know, someone who never appeared in public without a veil or a hood, someone whose decisions were sharp, fair, and utterly without hesitation. Nathaniel Gray brought the rumors to Cassian's attention during a private meeting, setting a small collection of merchant reports on the desk between them. It could be nothing more than an ambitious minor alpha consolidating power, Nathaniel said. It happens, particularly in territories weakened by old conflicts. But something about the timing troubles me, Your Majesty. This rise began roughly the same time Elena Voss disappeared. Cassian read through the reports twice, his expression unreadable. You believe they are connected? I believe it would be foolish to assume they are not, at least until we have more information, Nathaniel said carefully. Shall I send scouts to investigate? Cassian considered the question for a long moment, weighing the risk of appearing overly interested in a mystery that, officially, no longer concerned him, against the growing certainty that he needed answers he could not find any other way. Send someone discreet, he said finally. I want information, not confrontation. If there is any chance this mysterious leader is connected to Elena, I want to know before I do anything further. Nathaniel nodded and left to arrange the mission, leaving Cassian alone with his thoughts once again. That night, sleep continued to elude him. He found himself walking the halls of Blackstone Keep long after midnight, passing the chambers that had once, briefly, belonged to Elena, now empty and untouched, exactly as they had been left the night she vanished. He paused outside the door, hand resting against the old wood, feeling the same hollow ache that had become his constant companion in the weeks since her disappearance. He did not go inside. He had not gone inside since the night she left. Instead, he stood there for a long moment in the darkness, listening to the silence of the empty room beyond the door, before finally turning and walking back toward his own chambers, no closer to peace than he had been before. The following morning, a small group of scouts departed Blackstone Keep under the cover of a routine trade mission, carrying instructions to travel east and quietly gather whatever information they could about the mysterious rising power that had captured everyone's attention. None of them, including Cassian, fully understood what they might find when they arrived, but for the first time since the night of the rejection, Cassian felt something other than regret settling into the space beneath his ribs. He felt the faint, unfamiliar stirrings of hope, and beneath that hope, a growing certainty that whatever answers awaited him in the east, his life was about to change in ways he could not yet predict. The scouts Cassian sent east were led by a quiet, capable wolf named Callum Reed, a man known throughout Blackstone's ranks for his patience and his ability to move through unfamiliar territory without drawing attention. He had served under Cassian for nearly a decade, and he understood, without needing to be told directly, that this mission carried weight far beyond its official purpose as a trade inquiry. The journey east took the better part of a week. Callum and his small group traveled slowly, posing as merchants interested in establishing new trade routes, stopping in villages and small towns along the way to gather information through casual conversation rather than direct questioning. It was a method that required patience, but it was also the method least likely to draw suspicion. What he learned, piece by piece, painted a picture that troubled him more with each new detail. The rising power in the East operated under no official name that anyone seemed to know. Its leader, referred to by locals only as the Lady of the Eastern Hills, had begun her work modestly, offering fair trade terms and reliable protection to smaller packs that had long struggled under the shadow of more aggressive neighbors. Over the following months, her influence had grown steadily, not through force, but through the kind of quiet reliability that made allies trust her judgment, even when they did not fully understand her methods. "She never raises her voice," an innkeeper told Callum one evening, refilling his cup without being asked. "Never makes a threat she does not intend to follow through on, and never makes a promise she has not already found a way to keep. My own brother's territory joined her network 3 months ago. Best decision he ever made, by his account." Callum asked, carefully, whether anyone had seen the lady's face, whether anyone knew where she had come from before her rise began. The innkeeper shook his head slowly. "Not many, not really. She keeps herself guarded, out of caution more than vanity, I think. There are rumors, of course. Some say she comes from a noble bloodline that was thought extinguished in the old wars. Others say she is simply a clever woman who understood, better than most, what people actually need from those who claim to lead them." Callum wrote everything down in careful, coded notes meant only for Cassian's eyes, and continued his journey deeper into the Eastern Territories, drawing closer, with each passing day, to a truth that would change everything his king believed about the woman he had once rejected. He did not yet know, as he traveled those quiet eastern roads, that the woman he sought was closer than he realized, watching the movements of unfamiliar travelers through her own network of careful eyes, already aware that someone from Blackstone Keep had come looking for answers. Elena Voss had expected this moment would come eventually. She had simply not expected it to arrive quite so soon. Elena Voss had learned, at the age of 17, that the world did not wait patiently for anyone to grieve. It had been raining the night her father died, a cold autumn rain that soaked through her clothes as she knelt beside him, on a battlefield that should never have existed. Alpha Julian Voss had ruled his territory, with fairness rarely seen among the great packs, refusing to expand his borders through force, refusing to bow to the pressure of neighboring alphas who mocked his restraint as weakness. That restraint had made him beloved among his own people, and, ultimately, had made him a target for those who saw kindness as an opportunity rather than a virtue. Alpha Garrick Thorne had struck without warning, claiming a border dispute as justification for an invasion that had, in truth, been planned for months. Julian Voss had died defending a territory he had spent his entire life protecting, and Elena, only 17, and untested in any true conflict, had watched it happen from a hillside where her father's most loyal guards had dragged her against her will, refusing to let her join a battle she could not have survived. In the chaos that followed, with Thorne's forces sweeping through what remained of Voss territory, Elena had made the hardest decision of her young life. She had let the world believe she died alongside her father. It had not been difficult to arrange, in the confusion of that terrible night. A body, unrecognizable after the battle, buried quickly under her name, by guards loyal enough to follow her final order without question. A story spread carefully among the survivors, that the Alpha's daughter had fallen defending her people, a tragedy layered upon tragedy. And then, quietly, in the days that followed, Elena had slipped away from the ruins of everything she had ever known, carrying nothing but a small collection of her father's most trusted advisors, and a grief so heavy it had taken years to learn how to carry it without breaking. "You understand," Edmund Cole had told her, in those first desperate weeks of hiding, "that Thorne will not stop searching for any surviving heir. If word ever reaches him that you still live, he will hunt you as relentlessly as he hunted your father." "I understand," Elena had said, and even then, grieving, and barely more than a girl, there had been a steadiness in her voice that surprised the old strategist. "Then we make certain word never reaches him, not until I am ready for it to." What followed had been 2 years of careful, quiet rebuilding, conducted so far beneath the notice of the wider world that even Elena herself sometimes wondered if she was building anything real at all, or simply constructing an elaborate delay against a truth she was not yet ready to face. She trained in secret, harder than she had ever trained under her father's gentler guidance, pushing her body and her wolf past every limit she had once believed was fixed. She studied under Edmund's careful instruction, learning the intricate politics of pack law, the delicate balance of alliance and rivalry that shaped the great territories, the kind of patient strategy that her father, in his goodness, had perhaps never fully mastered. And slowly, carefully, she had begun rebuilding a network of trust, reaching out through coded letters and trusted intermediaries to families who had once served her father, testing which among them still held loyalty to the Voss name even now, when that name was believed to belong only to the dead. It was during this careful, quiet period that fate, with its usual disregard for convenient timing, had woven an unexpected thread into her plans. A distant matchmaking arrangement, conducted through channels that had no knowledge of her true identity, had paired her, under the assumed name Elena, with Cassian Blackwood, the young and increasingly powerful king of Blackstone territory. She had gone to him without any grand intention, curious more than anything, willing to see if the arrangement might offer some unexpected advantage for a woman rebuilding herself from nothing. What she had not expected, what had genuinely surprised her in those early months at Blackstone Keep, was the mate bond that formed between them almost immediately, a connection so strong and so undeniable that even Cassian's most skeptical advisors had been forced to acknowledge it. For a brief time, she had allowed herself to hope that something real might grow from that unexpected bond. Cassian, in those first months, had shown flashes of a man capable of genuine warmth beneath his guarded exterior, moments of unexpected kindness that made her wonder if perhaps she had found, by pure accident, a partner worthy of the truth she had been hiding. But those moments had grown rarer as time passed, worn away by the constant pressure of advisors who whispered that a king's strength was measured by the strategic value of his mate, not by fate's careless matching. Cassian had grown colder, more distant, more concerned with appearances than with the quiet, steady person standing beside him. And Elena, watching this transformation with the same careful patience she applied to everything, had begun to understand that the rejection she eventually faced had never truly been a possibility. It had been an inevitability, building slowly beneath the surface for months before it ever found its way into words. She had prepared for it, in her own quiet way, long before that final humiliating night in the Great Hall. She had continued her secret training, even during her time at Blackstone Keep, finding hidden hours before dawn to maintain the strength she had built. She had continued corresponding with her network of loyal contacts, careful never to leave any trace that might connect Elena Voss, mate candidate of Blackstone Keep, to the growing whispers of a mysterious woman quietly building influence in the East. By the time Cassian stood before his kingdom and rejected her, Elena was not walking away from safety into uncertainty. She was walking away from a temporary detour, back toward the path she had always intended to walk, toward the reclamation of a bloodline and a birthright that had been stolen from her 2 years earlier, on a rain-soaked battlefield. The cold smile she had given Cassian that night had not been performance. It had been the simple, honest expression of someone who understood, with complete clarity, exactly what came next. Now, sitting in her eastern manor, as reports arrived of a Blackstone scout traveling quietly through her territory, gathering information under the guise of a trade inquiry, Elena found herself facing a new and more immediate question. Not whether Cassian would eventually learn the truth of who she was, but how soon that truth would arrive, and whether she was truly prepared for what would follow. The scout has been asking careful questions in 3 separate villages, Priscilla reported, setting a stack of notes on the table before Elena. He is skilled, more skilled than a typical merchant scout would need to be. Our contacts believe he serves Blackstone Keep directly, likely reporting to the king himself. Elena studied the notes carefully, recognizing immediately the careful, methodical pattern of someone who had been trained to gather intelligence without drawing suspicion. Cassian sent him. It seems likely, Edmund agreed. The timing is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Word of your rising influence has spread far enough now that it was only a matter of time before it reached Blackstone Keep. What would you have us do? Felix asked, watching Elena with the eager attentiveness of someone still learning the full weight of the decisions being made around him. Elena set the notes down and considered the question for a long moment, weighing the various paths available to her. She could have the scout intercepted, his findings suppressed, delaying the inevitable moment of discovery a little longer. She could allow him to continue his investigation unhindered, curious to see how much he might learn and how Cassian might respond to whatever truth reached him. Or she could take a more direct approach entirely, one that would put the matter to rest on her own terms, rather than leaving it to unfold through rumor and speculation. Let him continue his work, she said finally. "But watch him carefully. I want to know exactly what he learns, and exactly what he reports back to Blackstone Keep. If Cassian is going to learn the truth of who I am, I would prefer it happen in a manner I control, rather than through half-formed rumors that might distort the truth further than it already has been." "And if he learns enough to bring the king himself east?" Priscilla asked carefully. Elena's expression remained calm, though something steady and resolute settled behind her eyes. "Then he will find exactly what he deserves to find. A woman who no longer waits for anyone's approval, and who has built something entirely her own, with or without his blessing." The council meeting continued for another hour, discussing the ongoing negotiations with smaller territories along the northern border, the careful expansion of trade agreements that had begun strengthening Elena's growing network of allies, and the persistent threat posed by Alpha Garrick Thorne, who continued to claim authority over lands that rightfully belonged to the Voss bloodline. But even as the discussion moved forward, a part of Elena's attention remained fixed on the knowledge that her carefully constructed anonymity was, for the first time in 2 years, beginning to unravel at the edges. She had known this moment would come eventually. She had simply not expected the person to discover her true identity to be the very man who had once stood before his entire kingdom and declared her unworthy to stand beside him. There was a certain bitter irony in that, one that Elena allowed herself to acknowledge privately, in the quiet hours after the council meeting ended, and the manor grew still around her. Later that evening, as she walked alone through the garden she had planted with her own hands, cultivating something beautiful and lasting from soil that had once belonged to no one in particular, Elena found herself thinking not of Cassian's rejection, but of her father, and the lessons he had taught her long before the war that took his life. "Power," Julian Voss had told her once, when she was still a child sitting at his feet during long council meetings she barely understood, "is not measured by how loudly you can demand respect. It is measured by how quietly you can earn it, and how steadily you can hold it once it is yours." She had carried those words with her through every difficult decision of the past 2 years, through every quiet act of rebuilding that had brought her, piece by careful piece, to where she now stood, a leader in her own right, respected by allies who knew nothing of her true bloodline, feared by no one who did not already have reason to fear the consequences of underestimating her. Whatever happened when the truth finally reached Cassian Blackwood, whatever choices he made in response to learning who she truly was, Elena understood, with the same calm certainty that had carried her through every difficult moment since that rain-soaked night 2 years earlier, that her strength no longer depended on his recognition of it. She had built something real, entirely on her own terms, and nothing that happened next, not Cassian's regret, not Thorne's ambition, not any challenge still waiting on the horizon, was going to take that away from her. The following morning, word arrived that changed the careful calculations Elena had been making. Callum Reed, the scout sent from Blackstone Keep, had grown bold enough in his investigation to directly approach one of Elena's own trusted allies, a minor territory leader named Grant Whitfield, who had joined her network only 2 months earlier. Grant, uncertain how to handle the unexpected inquiry, had sent an urgent message to the manor, requesting guidance, before responding to the scout's careful questions about the identity of the Lady of the Eastern Hills. Elena read the message twice, then set it down and looked around the council table at the small group who had become, over 2 years of careful work, something close to family. "It seems," she said, with the faintest trace of something that might have been amusement beneath her steady composure, "that the time for careful hiding has finally reached its natural end." She rose from her chair, walked to the window, and looked out toward the western hills, where somewhere beyond her sight, a king who had once called her unworthy was about to learn exactly how wrong he had been. "Send word to Grant," she said finally, turning back to face her council. "Tell him to answer the scout's questions honestly. It is time Cassian Blackwood learned the truth, on my terms, in my own time." The decision, once made, settled over her with a strange and unexpected lightness, as though she had been carrying the weight of her hidden identity for so long that its release felt almost like relief. Whatever came next, whatever confrontation or reckoning awaited her in the days ahead, Elena Voss was finally ready to step fully into the light as exactly who she had always been meant to become. Grant Whitfield received Elena's instructions with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had spent 2 anxious days avoiding the Blackstone Scout's careful questions, uncertain how much to reveal, uncertain whether honesty or continued silence better served the lady he had pledged himself to serve. Now, with clear guidance finally in hand, he arranged a meeting with Callum Reed at a quiet inn on the edge of his small territory, choosing neutral ground for a conversation he suspected would carry significant weight. Callum arrived promptly, still maintaining his careful merchant disguise, though something in his manner suggested he had grown weary of the pretense over the past several days. "You wish to speak with me," Callum said, settling into the seat across from Grant. "I confess, I had begun to think my questions would go unanswered indefinitely." Grant studied the other man for a long moment before responding. "I have been given permission to answer them honestly, on behalf of someone whose trust I value greatly. But I would ask, before I say anything further, who exactly you serve, and why the answers matter so much to you." Callum hesitated only briefly before deciding that honesty, at this point, served him better than continued caution. "I serve Alpha King Cassian Blackwood. He sent me east to gather information about the rising influence in this region, particularly regarding the identity of the woman known as the Lady of the Eastern Hills. And why does your king care so deeply about her identity?" "That," Callum admitted, "is a question I am not fully certain I can answer, even for myself. But I believe it connects to a woman who disappeared from Blackstone Keep several weeks ago, under circumstances that remain unexplained." Grant nodded slowly, having suspected as much from the pattern of Callum's careful investigation. "Then I will tell you what I have been given permission to share. The woman you seek, the Lady of the Eastern Hills, is indeed connected to the disappearance you describe. Beyond that, I believe the details of her true identity are best delivered directly by her, rather than second-hand through an intermediary such as myself." "Will she agree to meet with the king?" Callum asked, unable to fully hide the urgency in his voice. "That," Grant said, "is not my decision to make. But I can arrange for a message to be delivered, carrying your king's questions directly to her, if that is what you wish." Callum considered the offer carefully, understanding that this was likely the best outcome he could hope to achieve, through careful investigation alone. "Yes, please arrange it. My king has waited weeks for answers. I believe he is prepared to wait a little longer, if it means those answers finally arrive." The message Grant sent that evening, carefully worded and carried by a trusted rider through the quiet eastern roads, reached Elena's manor within 2 days. She read it alone in her study, standing by the same window where she had once watched the sunset paint the sky, in shades of orange and violet, on the evening her council first gathered to plan the reclamation of her father's legacy. The message was simple, respectful, carrying none of the arrogance she remembered from the man who had once stood before his kingdom and declared her unworthy. It requested, on behalf of Alpha King Cassian Blackwood, the opportunity for a meeting, at a time and place of her choosing, to discuss matters of significant importance to both their territories. Elena read the message twice, then set it down on her desk, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to fully consider what a meeting with Cassian might actually mean. Part of her, the part still carrying the memory of standing alone in that great hall, while an entire kingdom watched him call her worthless, wanted nothing more than to refuse the request entirely, to let him continue searching blindly for answers he did not deserve to receive so easily. But a larger part of her, the part shaped by 2 years of careful strategy and patient rebuilding, understood that a direct meeting, conducted entirely on her own terms, offered opportunities that continued hiding could not provide. If Cassian was going to learn the truth of who she was regardless, better that he learn it in a setting where she controlled every aspect of the encounter, rather than through rumors that might grow distorted with each retelling. She called her council together that same evening, presenting Cassian's request, and watching their reactions carefully, before sharing her own thoughts on the matter. "A meeting carries risk," Edmund said cautiously. "Once he knows the truth of your identity, that knowledge cannot be taken back. If his intentions are not what they appear, if this request is somehow connected to Thorne's ambitions rather than genuine concern, you would be placing yourself in significant danger." "I have considered that possibility," Elena said, "which is why any meeting will take place here, in territory I control, surrounded by allies I trust completely. Cassian Blackwood will come to me, on my terms, or he will not come at all." Priscilla studied Elena carefully, searching her expression for something beyond the careful strategic reasoning she had just offered. "And if his intentions are genuine?" if he has spent these past weeks truly searching for you out of something more than simple curiosity about a mysterious rising power. Elena did not answer immediately, considering the question with the same careful weight she gave to every difficult decision. Then I suppose we will finally learn whether the mate bond that connects us was ever built on anything real, or whether it was simply an unfortunate accident of fate that neither of us was ever meant to honor. She sent her response the following morning, agreeing to a meeting at her manor within 2 weeks' time, giving Cassian just enough time to make the journey east, while giving herself just enough time to prepare for whatever confrontation, reconciliation, or reckoning awaited them both. As the rider carrying her response disappeared down the eastern road, Elena stood at her window once again, watching, until the horizon swallowed the last trace of movement, and allowed herself to acknowledge, quietly and only to herself, that the calm certainty she had maintained through every difficult moment of the past 2 years, felt, for the first time, genuinely uncertain about what waited ahead. When Callum Reed returned to Blackstone Keep with news of the arranged meeting, Cassian felt something shift in his chest that he had not expected, a strange combination of relief and dread so intertwined he could not easily separate one from the other. "She agreed to see you," Callum reported, standing before Cassian in the same study where the king had spent so many sleepless nights over the past several weeks. "Though I should tell you, Your Majesty, the meeting will take place entirely on her terms, at her manor, surrounded by her own allies. She made no promises beyond that." "Did you learn anything of her identity?" Cassian asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would not come easily. "Only that she is connected to the woman who disappeared from Blackstone Keep. Beyond that, the local ally who arranged the meeting insisted the full truth was hers alone to share." Callum paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But Your Majesty, based on everything I observed during my time in the Eastern Territories, I do not believe you are dealing with an ordinary woman who simply managed to escape unnoticed. Whoever she has become, she commands genuine respect and genuine loyalty from people who have no reason to offer, either without cause." Cassian absorbed this information in silence, staring out the window of his study toward the eastern horizon, where somewhere beyond his sight, answers waited that would either confirm or completely upend everything he believed about the mistake he had made weeks earlier. "Prepare for the journey east," he said finally. "I want to leave within 3 days." "Your Majesty," Damon interjected carefully, having remained quiet through most of the conversation. "If I may ask, what do you hope to accomplish with this meeting? An apology? An explanation? Or something more?" Cassian considered the question for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of honesty he had rarely allowed himself in the weeks since Elena's disappearance. "I do not fully know, Damon. I know that I made an error I do not fully understand the shape of yet. I know that the ache I have carried since the night I rejected her has not lessened, despite every attempt I have made to convince myself it would. And I know that whatever waits for me in the East, whether it is forgiveness or something far colder, I need to face it directly, rather than continuing to hide behind pride that has cost me more than I was ever willing to admit." Damon studied his king for a long moment, seeing in his expression something he had not seen since before the rejection ceremony, a genuine vulnerability that Cassian had spent years learning to hide beneath careful composure. "Then I will prepare the journey east," Damon said quietly, "and I will hope, for your sake and for the sake of this entire kingdom, that whatever truce awaits you there is one you are prepared to accept, whatever form it ultimately takes." 3 days later, as the sun rose over Blackstone Keep, Cassian Blackwood departed his territory with a small, carefully chosen escort, riding east toward a meeting that would finally reveal the truth behind Elena Voss's mysterious disappearance, and toward a reckoning neither he nor Elena fully understood the true weight of yet. The journey east took 6 days, longer than Cassian would have liked, but the terrain between Blackstone territory and the eastern hills was rough enough that hurrying risked exhausting the horses before the journey's true purpose could even begin. He spent most of those 6 days in near silence, speaking only when necessary, his mind turning over question after question that he could not answer, until he finally stood face to face with the woman he had once so carelessly discarded. Damon rode beside him for much of the journey, offering quiet company without pressing for conversation Cassian was not ready to have. It was only on the final evening before their arrival, as they made camp within sight of the hills that marked the edge of Elena's territory, that Damon finally broke the silence that had settled between them. "You have not asked what you intend to say to her," Damon observed, settling beside the small fire they had built for warmth against the evening chill. Cassian stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "I have thought of little else for 6 days, and I still do not know. What does one say to a person you humiliated in front of an entire kingdom, only to discover weeks later that everything you believed about her was wrong? Perhaps," Damon suggested carefully, "you begin with the truth. Not the rehearsed apology a king is expected to offer, but the actual truth of what you have felt since the night she left." Cassian considered this in silence, watching sparks rise from the fire and disappear into the darkening sky above them. He thought of the hollow ache that had never truly left him, the sleepless nights, the strange weakening he had felt in himself that his physicians could not explain, but that he now understood, with growing certainty, had been the mate bond itself, protesting the careless way he had severed it. "The truth," he said finally, "is that I do not fully understand why I said what I said that night. I believed, at the time, that I was protecting the strength of my kingdom by rejecting someone my advisors deemed unworthy. But looking back, I think I was simply afraid." Damon raised an eyebrow, genuine surprise crossing his features. "Afraid of what exactly?" "Afraid of how much the bond mattered to me," Cassian admitted, the words coming slowly, as though he were discovering them for the first time even as he spoke them aloud. "I had spent my entire life being told that a king's strength comes from control, from strategic thinking, from never allowing sentiment to influence important decisions. And then this bond formed, this connection I never asked for and could not fully explain, and it frightened me more than any enemy ever has. Rejecting Elena felt, at the time, like reclaiming control over something that had begun to control me instead. And now?" Cassian was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Now I understand that control built on rejecting the one genuine connection I have ever felt was never true control at all. It was simply fear, dressed up in the language of strength." They said little else that evening, but something had shifted in the conversation, a small crack of honesty that Damon suspected would matter greatly in the confrontation waiting for them the following day. They arrived at the border of Elena's territory the next morning, greeted not with hostility, but with the careful, measured caution of well-trained guards, who clearly expected their arrival and had prepared accordingly. A young wolf, barely more than a boy, stepped forward to greet them. "Alpha King Blackwood," he said, with a formal politeness that carried an undercurrent of watchful wariness. "The lady has been expecting you. If you and your escort will follow me, I will guide you to the manor." The ride through Elena's territory revealed, in careful and unmistakable detail, exactly how much she had built in the 2 years and weeks since her disappearance from Blackstone Keep. The lands were well tended, prosperous in a way that spoke of careful and thoughtful leadership. Small villages they passed showed none of the fear or tension that often marked territories under uncertain or aggressive rule. Instead, there was a quiet, steady sense of order, of people going about their lives with the kind of confidence that only comes from trusting the leadership above them. Cassian noticed all of this with growing unease, understanding with each passing mile that whoever Elena had become in the time since she left him, she had built something genuinely impressive, something that had nothing to do with the fragile, unworthy image he had once carelessly assigned to her. The manor itself, when they finally arrived, was modest by the standards of a king's court, but elegant in its simplicity, surrounded by carefully cultivated gardens that spoke of someone who valued beauty built through patient, deliberate effort, rather than inherited wealth. Elena stood waiting for them in the manor's main courtyard, flanked by Edmund Cole and Priscilla Vane, dressed not in the simple traveling clothes Cassian remembered from Blackstone Keep, but in attire that carried quiet authority, elegant without being ostentatious, the clothing of someone who had grown fully into a position of genuine leadership. For a long moment, Cassian simply stared at her, taking in every detail of a woman who looked both entirely familiar and somehow completely different from the person he remembered rejecting weeks earlier. There was a steadiness in her posture, a calm confidence in the way she held his gaze without flinching, that he did not recognize from their time together at Blackstone Keep. "Cassian," she said, her voice even and controlled, giving nothing away. "Welcome to my territory. I trust the journey was not too difficult." "Elena," he said, and then, correcting himself with visible effort, or perhaps that is not the name I should be using anymore. Something flickered briefly across her expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Elena will suffice, for now. There will be time for fuller explanations once we are somewhere more private. She led him and his small escort into the manor's main hall, where a modest meal had been prepared, though Cassian found he had little appetite for food given the weight of the conversation he knew was coming. Damon and the rest of his escort were shown to separate quarters to rest after the long journey, leaving Cassian alone with Elena, Edmund, and Priscilla in a private study, lined with books and maps that spoke of careful, ongoing strategic planning. "I imagine you have questions," Elena said, once they were settled, her tone carefully neutral. "More than I know how to ask," Cassian admitted, and there was an honesty in his voice that seemed to genuinely surprise her. "But I suppose the most important one is simply this. Who are you truly, Elena? Because the woman I rejected weeks ago does not match the leader whose territory I have just ridden through." Elena studied him for a long moment before answering, weighing, perhaps for the final time, whether the trust required to share the full truth was one she was ready to extend. "My true name," she said finally, "is Elena Voss, daughter of Alpha Julian Voss, who ruled the Northern Territories before he was killed 2 years ago, in a war started by Alpha Garrick Thorne. I have spent the 2 years since his death, hiding my identity, rebuilding what strength I could in secret, waiting for the moment I would be ready to reclaim what was taken from my family." Cassian sat in stunned silence, the pieces of a puzzle he had been struggling to assemble for weeks, finally clicking into place, with a weight he had not fully prepared himself for. "You allowed the world to believe you died alongside your father." "I did," Elena confirmed. "It was the only way to protect myself long enough to rebuild. If Thorne had known I survived, he would have hunted me relentlessly, and I was in no position, at 17 years old, freshly grieving, to defend myself against a man who had already killed my father." "And the mate bond that formed between us," Cassian said slowly. "You knew, this entire time, that I had rejected the daughter of a fallen Alpha bloodline, believing her to be nothing more than an ordinary, powerless woman." "I knew," Elena confirmed, her voice steady, despite the weight of the admission. "I chose not to reveal the truth to you during our time together, in part because I was still uncertain whether it was safe to do so, and in part because I wanted to see who you truly were, without the complications my true identity would inevitably bring." "And what you saw," Cassian said quietly, understanding now with painful clarity, "was a man who called you unworthy, without ever truly knowing you at all." Elena did not answer immediately, and the silence that stretched between them carried more weight than any words could have. "Yes," she said finally, "that is exactly what I saw." The silence that followed Elena's words stretched long enough that Edmund and Priscilla exchanged a careful glance, uncertain whether to remain in the room or offer the two of them privacy for whatever came next. Cassian sat very still, his hands folded in his lap, staring at the woman across from him with an expression that carried none of the pride he had shown in that great hall weeks earlier. "I do not know how to make right what I did," he said finally, his voice low and rough with an honesty that seemed to cost him considerable effort. "I stood before my entire kingdom and called you weak, unworthy, ordinary, when in truth, you were carrying grief and responsibility I cannot fully imagine, rebuilding a legacy stolen from you through violence, and doing so with a strength I failed completely to recognize." "You are not entirely wrong to have called me ordinary," Elena said, surprising him with the calm honesty of her response. "In many ways, I was exactly what I appeared to be during our time together, a woman doing her best to navigate an unfamiliar court, uncertain how much of herself she could safely reveal. The difference, Cassian, is that ordinary does not mean unworthy. It never did. You built an entire judgment around a single narrow idea of what strength should look like, and you never once considered that strength might wear a quieter face than the one you expected." Cassian absorbed this in silence, the truth of her words settling over him with uncomfortable clarity. He thought of his advisors, of the endless conversations about strategic value and bloodline strength that had shaped his thinking for months before that fateful rejection ceremony, and understood now, with painful hindsight, how thoroughly he had allowed their narrow definitions to override his own judgment. I have spent every day since that night trying to understand what I actually felt, beneath the pride and the fear, he said, and what I keep returning to is this. The bond between us did not weaken because it was flawed. It weakened because I severed it out of fear I did not have the courage to name at the time. I was afraid of how much you mattered to me, and rejecting you felt, in that moment, like reclaiming control I never actually had to begin with. Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of the performance she half expected, the kind of practiced apology a king might offer when convenient, rather than out of genuine reflection. What she found instead was something rawer, something that matched the exhaustion she had heard described in reports of his search for her over the past weeks. I appreciate the honesty, she said finally, but Cassian, honesty alone does not undo what happened in that hall. I have built something here, something entirely my own, built on strength I discovered without your help and without your approval. I am not the same woman who once hoped, quietly, that our arrangement might grow into something real. I have changed. And I am not certain that whatever remains between us, whatever the bond continues to pull toward, is enough to bridge the distance that now exists. The words landed with quiet, devastating weight, and Cassian felt them settle into the same hollow space beneath his ribs that had ached constantly since the night she disappeared. Then tell me what you need, he said, and I will find a way to offer it. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because you deserve, at the very least, the honest effort I failed to give you the first time. Elena rose from her seat and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens she had built with her own hands over the past several months, giving herself a moment to consider his words before responding. For now, she said finally, turning back to face him, I need time. Time to decide whether the man standing before me today is truly different from the king who rejected me weeks ago, or whether this is simply desperation speaking, born from the discomfort of an unresolved bond rather than genuine understanding. Cassian nodded slowly, accepting the terms she offered without argument. Then I will give you that time, however much you need. But Elena, I want you to know that whatever you decide, I do not intend to simply walk away and pretend this conversation never happened. I made a mistake that cost me more than I understood was possible to lose, and I intend to spend as long as it takes proving that the man standing before you now is genuinely different from the one who wronged you. Elena said nothing to that, though something in her carefully composed expression softened, just slightly, at the sincerity in his voice. Outside the window, the afternoon light shifted across the gardens, and somewhere beyond the walls of the manor, the first quiet threads of a much larger conflict, one involving Alpha Garrick Thorne and the contested northern territories, continued weaving themselves into a future neither of them could yet fully see. For now, there was only this moment, fragile and uncertain, between two people who had once been bound by fate and then torn apart by pride, standing at the beginning of something that might yet become reconciliation, or might simply become the quiet, respectful distance of two leaders who had learned, through painful experience, exactly how much a single moment of cruelty could cost. That evening, as the manor settled into quiet, Priscilla found Elena alone in the garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath the fading light of dusk. You did not tell him everything, Priscilla observed, settling beside her. There will be time for the rest, if he proves himself worth the telling, Elena said. For now, it is enough that he knows the truth of who I am. What he does with that truth, and how he conducts himself in the days ahead, will tell me far more than any words he offers tonight. And Thorne? Will you tell the king of the threat gathering along your northern border? Elena considered the question carefully. Not yet. If Cassian is to prove himself, I would rather he prove it through patience and genuine effort, not through the convenient opportunity to play protector against a threat he did not yet know existed. Let him earn trust the slow way, Priscilla. It is the only way that will mean anything. Priscilla nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words, even as she recognized the difficulty of the path ahead. And if Thorne moves against us before that trust is fully earned? Elena's gaze drifted toward the northern hills, dark now beneath the deepening evening sky, where somewhere beyond her sight, an old enemy continued gathering strength and ambition. Then we will face that threat as we have faced every threat these past 2 years, together and on our own terms. She rose from the bench and walked back toward the manor, leaving Priscilla to follow, both women carrying the quiet, unspoken understanding that whatever peace had been found in the conversation with Cassian that afternoon, it was only the beginning of a far larger story still waiting to unfold. Cassian remained in Elena's territory for 3 days following their initial conversation, though he was careful not to overstay whatever fragile welcome she had extended. He spent much of that time observing rather than intruding, watching from a respectful distance as she moved through her daily responsibilities, with the kind of steady competence that continued to reshape everything he thought he understood about her. On the first morning, he watched her settle a dispute between 2 neighboring villages over water rights, listening patiently to both sides, before offering a solution that satisfied neither party completely, but that both accepted as genuinely fair. On the second day, he observed a council meeting from the back of the room, at Elena's grudging permission, and saw firsthand the careful, thoughtful way she weighed military strategy against economic necessity, always considering the well-being of her people above the simple accumulation of power. It was nothing like the councils he was accustomed to at Blackstone Keep, where advisors often spoke more of strategic advantage and territorial expansion than of the actual people whose lives their decisions would affect. Watching Elena work, Cassian found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. She was, in nearly every measurable way, a more thoughtful and effective leader than he had become in recent years, shaped by advisors who valued strength over wisdom. On the evening of his second day, he found himself walking through her gardens alone. Having excused himself early from a council session, he had no true place attending. He was examining a small cluster of flowers he did not recognize when Edmund Cole approached, his expression carefully neutral. "You have been quiet these past 2 days," Edmund observed, settling onto a nearby bench. "I confess, I expected either more defensiveness or more desperate pleading from a king caught in your position. Instead, you have simply watched." "What would pleading accomplish?" Cassian asked. "Elena has made it clear that words alone will not repair what I broke. I am trying, instead, to understand who she has become, so that whatever I offer going forward is built on genuine understanding, rather than desperate assumption." Edmund studied him for a long moment, something in his expression softening slightly at the response. That is, perhaps wiser than I expected from a man raised to believe that strength means never admitting fault. "I have had a great deal of time to reconsider what strength actually means," Cassian said quietly. "Watching Elena these past 2 days has taught me more about genuine leadership than years of council meetings at Blackstone Keep ever did." Edmund nodded slowly, then leaned forward, his voice dropping to something more careful and deliberate. "There is something you should understand, Your Majesty. If you truly intend to prove yourself worthy of a second chance with Elena, she has spent 2 years building this territory, not simply for the sake of building it, but as preparation for a threat that continues to grow along her northern border." Cassian's attention sharpened immediately. "What threat?" "Alpha Garrick Thorne," Edmund said, "the man responsible for her father's death, and for the destruction of the territory she was born to inherit. He continues to expand his influence into lands that rightfully belong to the Voss bloodline, and he does not yet know that Julian Voss's daughter survived. When he does learn the truth, and eventually he will, the conflict that follows will not be a small border dispute. It will be a war for the future of the entire northern region." Cassian absorbed this information with growing weight, understanding immediately the scale of what Elena had been quietly preparing for during her 2 years of careful rebuilding. "Why are you telling me this?" Elena chose not to share it herself. "Because I believe," Edmund said carefully, "that if you truly wish to prove yourself worthy of her trust, the most meaningful proof you could offer would not be words spoken in a private study, but genuine support offered when the true conflict finally arrives. Elena did not tell you because she wishes you to earn trust on your own timeline, not through convenient opportunity. But I am an old man who has watched her carry this burden largely alone for 2 years, and I confess I am not above hoping that a strong ally, once proven trustworthy, might ease some small part of that weight." Cassian sat with this information for a long moment, weighing the delicate balance between respecting Elena's wishes and understanding the genuine threat that continued to grow along her borders. "I will not act on this information without her knowledge or consent," he said finally. "But I thank you for trusting me with it. It will not be forgotten." Edmund studied him carefully, then nodded, apparently satisfied with the response. "That is, I think, precisely the answer Elena would want to hear, even if she has not yet decided whether to trust you enough to hear it directly from her own lips." On the morning of his third day, before departing back toward Blackstone Keep, Cassian requested one final private conversation with Elena, which she granted, though her expression remained carefully guarded as they settled once again into the quiet study where their first difficult conversation had taken place. "I do not wish to overstay a welcome I have not yet earned," he said, "but before I return to my own territory, I wanted to offer something more concrete than simple apology." "And what is that?" Elena asked, watching him carefully. "Time," he said, "as much as you require, without pressure, without expectation of any particular outcome. I will not send further scouts to investigate your territory. I will not attempt to use the mate bond as leverage to force a reconciliation you are not ready for. I will simply wait, and in the meantime, I will work to become the kind of leader whose trust would genuinely be worth extending, regardless of whether that trust is ever offered to me personally." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for the calculation she had half expected to find, the careful political maneuvering of a king seeking advantage through apparent humility. What she found instead seemed to be genuine sincerity, the same rawness she had glimpsed during their first conversation days earlier. "That is a reasonable offer," she said finally. "I will consider it seriously." "That is all I ask," Cassian said, rising to take his leave. At the door of the study, he paused, turning back to face her one final time. "For what it is worth, Elena, whatever you ultimately decide, I want you to know that watching you these past 3 days, seeing the territory you have built, and the people who genuinely trust your leadership, has shown me something I failed to understand during our time together at Blackstone Keep. You were never ordinary. I was simply too blinded by my own narrow definitions of strength to recognize what stood in front of me." He left without waiting for a response, understanding that whatever Elena decided to do with those words was entirely her choice to make, on her own timeline, without further pressure from him. The journey back to Blackstone Keep felt, to Cassian, entirely different from the journey east had been, where before he had traveled with anxious uncertainty, desperate for answers he did not yet possess. Now he traveled with a heavier, more complicated weight, the knowledge of a genuine wrong he had committed, and a clear understanding, for the first time, of exactly how much work lay ahead if he hoped to earn back what he had so carelessly thrown away. Damon rode beside him for much of the return journey, watching his king with quiet observation. "You seem different," he said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I feel different," Cassian admitted. "I spent 3 days watching a woman I once called unworthy lead a territory with more wisdom and compassion than I have managed in years at Blackstone Keep. It is difficult to return to my old certainties after witnessing that so clearly." "What will you do now?" Damon asked. Cassian considered the question carefully as the horses carried them steadily westward, back toward the keep that had felt, for weeks now, cold and empty in ways that had nothing to do with the physical temperature of its stone halls. "I will become the kind of king worth trusting," he said finally, "not to force Elena's hand, and not because I expect it to guarantee any particular outcome between us, but because watching her these past 3 days made me realize how far I have drifted from the leader I once hoped to become. Before my father's death, and my advisor's careful whispers convinced me that strength meant never showing vulnerability, never admitting fault, never allowing sentiment to shape important decisions. That is a significant change of philosophy for a king who has ruled a certain way for most of his adult life," Damon observed carefully. "It is," Cassian agreed, "but I have learned, this past month, exactly how much that philosophy has cost me. I am not willing to pay that price again, regardless of whether Elena ever forgives me for the first time I paid it." They rode the rest of the journey in comfortable silence, and when Blackstone Keep finally came into view on the horizon, its familiar stone walls rising against the sky, Cassian felt none of the relief he might once have expected upon returning home. Instead, he felt only the weight of a long road ahead, the difficult work of rebuilding not just a relationship he had damaged, but the very foundation of leadership he had allowed to grow crooked over years of listening to the wrong voices. He arrived at the keep to find his council already gathered, anxious for news of his journey east, and the mysterious rising power that had drawn so much of his attention over the past several weeks. He told them only what was necessary, that the Lady of the Eastern Hills was indeed connected to Elena's disappearance, that diplomatic relations between their territories would continue in the coming months, and that he expected the full council to support whatever careful, respectful engagement that relationship required going forward. Some of his advisors exchanged uncertain glances at the vagueness of this explanation, clearly hoping for more concrete details about the strategic advantages this new relationship might offer. Cassian, watching their reactions with new clarity, understood for the first time exactly how much their careful calculations had shaped his own thinking during the difficult months leading up to Elena's rejection. "I want it understood," he said, addressing the full council with a firmness that silenced any further questions, "that going forward, this territory's decisions will be shaped by genuine consideration of what serves our people well, not simply by narrow calculations of strategic advantage. I have learned, recently, exactly how costly that kind of narrow thinking can become, and I do not intend to repeat the mistake." The council meeting ended in an unusual silence, advisors uncertain how to respond to a king who seemed, quite suddenly, less interested in their careful strategic whispers than he had been in years. Cassian did not linger to explain further. He retreated instead to his study, where he spent the remainder of the evening drafting the first of what would become many careful, respectful letters to Elena, updates on the changes he was working to implement at Blackstone Keep, offered without expectation of response, simply as evidence of the genuine effort he had promised her before departing her territory. He did not yet know how long it would take to earn back what he had lost, or whether that trust would ever fully be restored, but for the first time since the night of the rejection ceremony, the hollow ache beneath his ribs had shifted into something else entirely. Not relief, not yet, but the steady, determined purpose of a man finally working towards something worth the effort it demanded. Weeks passed, and Elena continued to receive Cassian's letters with a careful, guarded consistency of her own, reading each one thoroughly before setting it aside without responding. The letters never asked for reconciliation, never pressed her for any particular outcome. They simply described, in honest and often surprisingly vulnerable detail, the changes he was working to implement at Blackstone Keep, the advisors he had begun listening to less, and the ones he had begun listening to more, the small, deliberate shifts in his approach to leadership that suggested genuine effort rather than convenient performance. Priscilla noticed the pattern of these letters, arriving with steady regularity, and one evening, while helping Elena review reports from the northern border, she finally asked the question that had been building in her mind for weeks. "You read every one of his letters," Priscilla observed, carefully, more than once, if I am not mistaken. "Why do you never respond?" Elena did not look up immediately from the report in front of her, though her hands stilled slightly at the question. "Because I am not yet certain what response would be honest. He asks for nothing in his letters, which I appreciate, but eventually he will want to know whether this effort is making any difference at all, and I do not yet have an answer I trust. Do you believe he has genuinely changed?" Elena set down the report finally, considering the question with the same careful weight she gave to every significant decision. "I believe he is trying, genuinely and consistently, which is more than I expected when he first arrived at my territory weeks ago. Whether trying consistently over several weeks is the same as genuine, lasting change, I cannot yet say. People are capable of sustained effort when something matters enough to them. The true test comes not in the weeks immediately following a mistake, but in how they behave once the immediate consequences begin to fade." "And Thorn?" Priscilla asked, shifting the conversation toward the more pressing concern that continued to occupy much of the council's attention. "Our scouts report increased activity along his eastern border, closer to our own territory than we have seen in months." Elena's expression grew more serious. "Then it seems the time for careful preparation is growing shorter than we hoped. Gather the full council. We need to discuss what comes next, and whether the moment has finally arrived to reveal my true identity beyond the small circle who already knows it." As the council gathered that evening to discuss the growing threat along their northern border, none of them yet understood how quickly the careful, patient rebuilding of the past 2 years was about to be tested by a conflict that had been gathering, quietly and inevitably, since the night Julian Voss fell on a rain-soaked battlefield 2 years earlier. The council meeting that followed ran late into the night, candles burning low as maps of the northern territories were spread across the long table, marked with the latest reports of Thorn's growing movements. Felix Marlowe, who had grown considerably more confident in his role over the past several months, was the first to speak once the reports had been fully reviewed. If Thorn learns of your identity before we are fully prepared to respond, he will move immediately, Felix said. He has spent 2 years believing the Voss bloodline extinguished. The moment he learns otherwise, everything he has built on that assumption becomes vulnerable, and men like Thorn do not respond well to vulnerability. They respond with force, swiftly and without hesitation. Which is precisely why timing matters more than anything else in the weeks ahead, Edmund added, tracing a line across the map with a steady finger. We must decide whether to reveal Elena's identity on our own terms, allowing us to control the narrative and rally allies before Thorn can respond, or continue concealing it as long as possible, buying time to strengthen our defenses even further. Elena listened to the discussion carefully, weighing the arguments on both sides, with the same patient consideration she brought to every difficult decision. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the calm certainty that had guided her through 2 years of careful rebuilding. We reveal it, she said. Not through Thorn's discovery, but through our own announcement, timed carefully to maximize the advantage it offers us. Every territory that once respected my father's rule deserves to know that his bloodline survives, and I would rather they learn that truth from me directly than through rumor, or through Thorn's inevitable propaganda once he does discover it. And Blackstone Keep? Priscilla asked carefully. Will you inform Cassian before the wider announcement, or allow him to learn alongside the rest of the region? Elena considered this question longer than the others, aware of the weight it carried beyond simple strategy. I will inform him, she said finally. Not because I owe him special consideration beyond any other ally, but because if the northern conflict with Thorn grows into full war, as I suspect it eventually will, Blackstone's strength could prove valuable, and he deserves the opportunity to decide, with full knowledge, whether he wishes to stand with us or remain neutral. The council continued planning late into the night, drafting the careful language of an announcement that would finally reveal, to the entire region, that Elena Voss, daughter of the fallen Alpha Julian Voss, had survived the war that claimed her father's life, and intended now to reclaim what rightfully belonged to her family's legacy. By the time the meeting finally ended, the candles had burned down to stubs, and Elena felt, for the first time in 2 years, the strange mixture of exhaustion and anticipation that comes from finally stepping toward a confrontation, long delayed, but never truly avoidable. Whatever came next, whatever war or reconciliation or reckoning waited on the horizon, the quiet years of hiding were finally, unmistakably, coming to an end. The announcement went out 3 days later, carried by trusted riders to every allied territory within reach, and by careful whisper networks into regions that had not yet formally aligned with Elena's growing influence. The message was simple, direct, and unmistakable in its implications. Elena Voss, daughter of the fallen Alpha Julian Voss, had survived the war that claimed her father's life, and now stood ready to reclaim the northern territories that rightfully belonged to her family's bloodline. The reaction across the region was immediate and varied. Smaller territories that had long resented Thorn's aggressive expansion sent messages of cautious support, relieved to learn that a legitimate alternative to his rule still existed. Old allies of Julian Voss, some of whom had believed the bloodline entirely extinguished, reached out with genuine emotion, offering renewed loyalty to a family they had once served with pride. And in Blackstone Keep, Cassian received the news not through official channels, but through a personal letter from Elena herself, the first direct response he had received to any of the letters he had sent over the past several weeks. He read it alone in his study, his hands surprisingly steady despite the significance of what the letter contained. The letter explained, in careful and measured detail, exactly what she had shared with him weeks earlier during their private conversation, now expanded for a wider audience. It described her intention to formally reclaim her father's territory, the growing threat posed by Alpha Garrick Thorn, and the likelihood that the coming months would bring genuine conflict to the northern region. At the very end, in a final paragraph that Cassian read 3 times, before fully absorbing its weight, Elena wrote that she was extending an invitation, not a demand, for Blackstone Keep to consider its position regarding the coming conflict, whether as an ally, as a neutral observer, or as something else entirely. The choice was his to make freely, without pressure from the mate bond that continued to connect them. Cassian set the letter down and sat in silence for a long moment, understanding immediately that this was not merely a political question requiring careful strategic calculation. It was, in its own quiet way, a test, an opportunity to demonstrate through action, rather than words, whether the changes he had been working to implement over the past several weeks represented genuine growth or simply convenient performance. He called an emergency council meeting that same evening. Alpha Garrick Thorne has controlled significant territory in the north for 2 years, Nathaniel Gray said, once the full council had gathered and Cassian had shared the contents of Elena's letter. A conflict with him would not be small or easily resolved. He commands considerable military strength, and any alliance with Elena Voss would place Blackstone directly in opposition to a powerful and aggressive neighbor. Which is precisely why I wanted this discussion held openly, rather than deciding alone based on personal considerations that some of you might view as compromising my judgment. Louisa Fenwick studied him carefully from across the table. May I ask directly, Your Majesty, whether your inclination toward alliance is shaped more by strategic consideration or by personal history with the lady in question? It was a fair question, and Cassian did not shy away from it. Both, if I am honest. I will not pretend the personal history does not matter to me. But I would ask you to consider the strategic reality as well. Alpha Garrick Thorne has expanded aggressively for 2 years, unchallenged by any significant regional power. If he succeeds in fully absorbing the northern territories, his ambition will not simply stop at those borders. Territories like our own, which share no border with the north currently, may eventually find ourselves facing the same aggressive expansion Elena's people have already suffered under. Supporting a legitimate challenge to Thorne's growing power serves our long-term interests, regardless of my personal history with Elena Voss. The council debated late into the evening, weighing military capacity, potential losses, and long-term strategic benefit against the very real risk of committing Blackstone's resources to a conflict that was not, strictly speaking, their own to fight. By the time the discussion finally concluded, the council remained divided, though a narrow majority leaned toward cautious support for Elena's cause, provided any commitment began with diplomatic and material support rather than immediate military engagement. I will send a formal response, Cassian said, once the meeting had ended and most of the council had departed, offering Blackstone's support, beginning with resources and diplomatic backing, with the understanding that further military commitment will depend on how the conflict develops in the weeks ahead. Damon remained behind after the others had gone, watching Cassian with careful consideration. This is a significant commitment, Your Majesty, built on a relationship that remains, by your own admission, deeply uncertain. I know, Cassian said, but Elena did not ask for this commitment to secure my personal favor. She offered a genuine choice, free of pressure from what remains between us. I intend to make that choice based on what I believe serves both territories well, not simply based on hope for reconciliation. And if the alliance strengthens the bond between you regardless? Damon asked, a faint knowing note in his voice. Cassian allowed himself the ghost of a smile, the first genuine one Damon had seen from him in weeks. Then I suppose that would simply be a fortunate consequence of doing what I believe is right, rather than the primary reason for doing it. He drafted his response to Elena that same night, offering Blackstone's support in careful, measured terms, committing resources and diplomatic backing, while making clear that further military engagement would be discussed and decided as the situation developed. He included, at the very end, a brief personal note, separate from the formal political response, thanking her for the trust implied in extending the choice to him freely, rather than assuming his support simply because of what remained unresolved between them. The response reached Elena's manor 5 days later, and she read it in the same careful, thorough manner she had read every previous letter, searching not just for the words themselves, but for the deeper intentions behind them. He has committed support, Edmund observed, reading the formal portion of the letter over her shoulder. Genuine support, not simply a symbolic gesture meant to secure your favor. That is a meaningful decision, particularly given the risk it carries for his own territory. It is, Elena agreed, though her expression remained carefully guarded, even as something in her chest loosened slightly at the confirmation of his commitment. Does this change your assessment of him? Priscilla asked carefully. Elena considered the question for a long moment before answering. It is one significant data point, among many, I will need before I fully trust the changes he claims to have made. But I will admit, Priscilla, it is a meaningful one. A man motivated purely by desire for reconciliation might have offered empty promises of full military support to win my favor. Instead, he offered careful, measured commitment that reflects genuine strategic thinking, as well as genuine care. That balance suggests something more substantial than desperate performance. The alliance, once formalized, brought immediate practical benefits to Elena's growing coalition against Thorne's ambitions. Blackstone's resources strengthened her northern defenses considerably, and the diplomatic weight of an alliance with one of the region's most powerful territories encouraged several smaller, previously hesitant pacts to formally commit their support as well. But it also brought new complications, as Alpha Garrick Thorne, upon learning of the growing alliance forming against him, began accelerating his own preparations, understanding that whatever advantage he had held through 2 years of unchallenged expansion was now under genuine threat. Reports began arriving within weeks of increased military activity along Thorne's borders, troop movements that suggested he was no longer content to simply wait and see how the situation developed. The careful, patient rebuilding that had characterized Elena's approach for 2 years was giving way, rapidly, to the urgent reality that genuine conflict was no longer a distant possibility, but an approaching certainty. Elena called her council together once more, this time joined by representatives from Blackstone Keep sent to formalize the growing coordination between their territories, and the conversation that followed carried none of the careful, measured pace of previous meetings. "Thorne is preparing for war," Nathaniel Gray reported, having traveled east, specifically to deliver Blackstone's assessment of the growing threat. "Our scouts estimate he could move within a matter of weeks, not months. If we intend to present a unified defense, the time for careful diplomatic preparation is rapidly closing." Elena studied the map spread before them, tracing the borders where the coming conflict would inevitably unfold, and felt the weight of 2 years of patient preparation finally converging toward the moment she had always known, somewhere in the back of her mind, was eventually coming. "Then we prepare for war," she said, her voice steady, despite the gravity of the words. "Carefully, and together. Thorne has had 2 years to grow comfortable in his assumption that no one would ever challenge what he built on my father's grave. It is time he learned exactly how wrong that assumption was." Over the following weeks, the alliance between Elena's territory and Blackstone Keep deepened considerably, driven not by sentiment, but by the urgent, practical necessity of preparing for a conflict that grew closer with each passing report from the northern border. Cassian himself traveled east twice more during this period, each visit shorter and more focused than his first, dedicated almost entirely to coordinating military strategy alongside Elena's council, rather than pursuing any personal reconciliation. It was during these visits that Elena began to notice something shifting in her own careful guardedness, something she had not expected and was not entirely certain how to interpret. Cassian, freed from the pressure of pursuing reconciliation directly, seemed to relax into a version of himself she had never fully seen during their original time together at Blackstone Keep. He listened more than he spoke during council discussions, deferring to Elena's judgment on matters of northern strategy, where her knowledge clearly exceeded his own, while offering genuine, valuable insight on matters of broader military coordination, where his experience proved useful. "You watch him carefully," Priscilla observed one evening, after Cassian had departed following a lengthy strategy session focused on coordinating defensive positions along the contested border. "I am simply assessing an ally's reliability," Elena said, though there was something in her tone that suggested even she was not entirely convinced by her own explanation. Priscilla said nothing further, though the knowing look she gave Elena suggested she understood the deeper truth Elena was not yet ready to fully acknowledge, even to herself. Meanwhile, along the northern border, the signs of Thorne's approaching aggression grew increasingly difficult to ignore. Scouts reported growing troop concentrations, supply lines being reinforced, and increasingly bold incursions into contested territory that had, until recently, remained under uneasy but stable division between rival claims. Felix Marlowe, tasked with overseeing much of the northern intelligence gathering, brought increasingly urgent reports to the council with each passing week. He has begun recalling allied pacts who owe him military obligation, Felix reported, during one particularly tense council meeting. This is not simple posturing anymore. He is genuinely preparing for a significant offensive, likely within the month. Elena absorbed this information with the same steady calm she had maintained through every previous crisis, though the weight of what was coming settled more heavily with each new report. Then we ensure our own preparations are equally thorough. Edmund, I want updated assessments of our combined defensive capacity, including Blackstone's committed resources, by the end of the week. The council meeting continued late into the evening, each member contributing pieces of a defensive strategy that grew more detailed and more urgent with each passing report. By the time the meeting finally concluded, exhaustion had settled over the entire group, but beneath that exhaustion ran a current of determined resolve that had not existed in quite the same way before the alliance with Blackstone Keep had formed. Whatever conflict Alpha Garrick Thorne believed he was preparing to win easily, against a territory he still assumed to be led by an inexperienced woman with no significant military backing, he was about to discover that 2 years of careful, patient rebuilding, combined with a genuine and growing alliance with one of the region's most powerful territories, had created a far more formidable opponent than his outdated assumptions had prepared him to face. 3 nights before the council expected Thorne's forces to make their first significant move, Cassian arrived unannounced at Elena's manor, having ridden through the night with a small escort, after receiving urgent word from his own scouts along the border. Thorne has moved earlier than anticipated, he said, finding Elena still awake in her study, reviewing the latest defensive reports by candlelight. My scouts spotted significant troop movement 2 days ahead of what Nathaniel's original assessment predicted. If the pattern holds, he intends to strike within the next 2 days, not the 2 weeks we prepared for. Elena set down the report she had been reviewing, her expression sharpening with immediate focus. Then we adjust our timeline accordingly. Wake the council. We need to finalize defensive positions tonight. As the manor came alive with the urgent activity of a council preparing for imminent conflict, Cassian found himself falling naturally into step beside Elena, coordinating logistics with an ease that surprised them both given the careful distance they had maintained over the preceding weeks. You did not have to ride through the night to deliver this news personally, Elena said quietly, as they walked together toward the council chamber, where the rest of her advisors were already gathering. A messenger would have sufficed. I know, Cassian admitted, but some information felt important enough to deliver myself, rather than trust to a message that might be delayed or intercepted. Elena glanced at him sideways, something unreadable passing behind her careful expression. Or perhaps you simply wanted to be here, when the moment finally arrived. Cassian did not deny it, and the honest silence that followed carried more weight than any words could have offered. They entered the council chamber together, and for the remainder of that long night, the personal complexities that continued to exist between them were set aside entirely, replaced by the focused, urgent work of preparing 2 allied territories for a war that was no longer a distant possibility, but an approaching certainty that would test everything both of them had spent the past several months carefully building. The attack came at dawn, exactly as the revised intelligence had predicted, breaking across the contested northern border, with the ferocity of a man who had spent 2 years believing himself unopposed, and had only recently discovered how wrong that belief truly was. Elena stood at the center of her defensive lines, dressed for battle in a manner none of her allies from Blackstone Keep had ever seen before, her wolf form powerful and commanding, in a way that immediately silenced any lingering doubt among Cassian's warriors about whether their alliance had been wisely chosen. She moved through the early chaos of the battle with the same calm, calculated precision she brought to council meetings, directing her forces with a clarity that cut through the noise and confusion of combat. Cassian fought alongside her, coordinating Blackstone's contributed forces along the eastern flank of the defensive line, watching with a mixture of awe and fierce protectiveness, as Elena proved, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly how formidable the woman he had once carelessly rejected truly was. Alpha Garrick Thorne led his forces personally, a massive gray wolf whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had been earned through 2 years of unchallenged expansion. He had expected, based on outdated intelligence, to face a disorganized territory led by an inexperienced young woman with no significant military backing. What he found instead was a carefully coordinated defense, reinforced by one of the region's most powerful territories, led by a woman whose tactical mind proved every bit as sharp as her father's had once been. "You have grown bold, little Voss," Thorne snarled, as the battle drew him within sight of Elena across the chaotic field, recognition dawning in his eyes as he finally understood exactly who had been building this formidable resistance to his ambitions. I should have known that fire does not simply extinguish itself, even when we believe the flame has been fully smothered. You should have known many things 2 years ago, Elena replied, her voice carrying clearly across the noise of battle, steady and unafraid, despite facing directly the man responsible for her father's death. Instead, you chose violence over patience, and now you face the consequence of underestimating what that violence left behind. The battle that followed was fierce and costly on both sides, stretching through most of the morning, as the defensive line held firm against wave after wave of Thorn's forces. Elena fought with a controlled intensity that spoke of 2 years of secret training finally finding its true purpose, while Cassian's forces provided crucial support along the flanks, preventing Thorn's larger numbers from finding the gaps they desperately sought to exploit. It was midday, as the battle reached its most critical and uncertain point, that Thorn, recognizing his frontal assault was failing against the coordinated defense, attempted a desperate and reckless maneuver, pushing his personal guard directly toward Elena's position, in an attempt to end the conflict swiftly, by eliminating its most significant symbol. Cassian saw the maneuver forming before most of the others on the field, understanding immediately the danger it represented, and moved without hesitation to intercept, cutting through Thorn's advancing guard with a fierce determination that surprised even his own warriors. The confrontation that followed between Cassian and several of Thorn's most experienced fighters was brutal and prolonged, testing every ounce of skill and endurance he had built over years of leading Blackstone's forces. He took injuries in the process, wounds that would require careful attention once the battle finally ended, but he held the line long enough for Elena, alerted to the danger by his intervention, to reposition her own forces and close the gap Thorn had hoped to exploit. By the time the sun began sinking toward late afternoon, Thorn's forces had been pushed back decisively, their momentum broken by the coordinated defense they had failed to properly anticipate. Thorn himself, recognizing the battle was lost, ordered a retreat, pulling his remaining forces back across the contested border with the bitter understanding that his 2 years of unchallenged expansion had finally, decisively, come to an end. As the immediate chaos of battle subsided, replaced by the exhausted work of tending wounded and accounting for losses, Elena found Cassian near the eastern flank, being tended by one of her own healers for the injuries he had sustained during his intervention against Thorn's guard. "You should not have moved so directly into that confrontation," she said, kneeling beside him as the healer worked carefully on a deep wound along his shoulder. "It was reckless." "Perhaps," Cassian admitted, wincing slightly as the healer's careful hands worked at the injury. "But I saw the danger forming, and I was not willing to stand back and watch when I had the ability to prevent it." Elena studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her, carefully guarded expression. "You could have been killed." "I know," Cassian said simply. "But so could you, if that maneuver had succeeded. I have already lost you once, Elena, through my own foolish pride. I was not prepared to lose you again to Thorn's ambition, when there was something I could do to prevent it." The words hung between them, heavy with a significance that went far beyond the immediate context of battle. Elena said nothing for a long moment, watching him with an expression that had, for the first time since his arrival weeks earlier, lost some of its careful guardedness. "Rest," she said finally, rising to her feet. "There is still much work to be done today, but it can wait until your wounds have been properly tended." She walked away to attend to other matters of the battle's aftermath, but something in the careful distance she had maintained toward him for weeks had shifted, just slightly, in the wake of his willingness to place himself in genuine danger to protect her. Over the following days, as both territories worked to recover from the costs of the battle and assess the shifting balance of power that Thorn's decisive defeat had created, the relationship between Elena and Cassian continued evolving in ways neither of them fully addressed directly, but that both of them noticed nonetheless. He remained in her territory longer than any previous visit, ostensibly to coordinate the ongoing recovery efforts and discuss the strategic implications of Thorn's weakened position, but the conversations between them, once strictly focused on military and political matters, gradually began to include quieter moments of genuine connection that reminded Elena, uncomfortably at times, of the brief period during their original time together, when she had allowed herself to hope for something real between them. The northern territories that once feared to openly oppose Thorn have begun reaching out, Edmund reported, during one of the council meetings held in the days following the battle. With his forces weakened, and his reputation for invincibility shattered, several smaller packs are now seeking alliance with your bloodline directly, Elena. This victory has done more than simply defend our border. It has fundamentally shifted the balance of power across the entire northern region. Then we must be careful how we proceed, Elena said, though there was a note of quiet satisfaction beneath her characteristic caution. Rebuilding influence too aggressively risks appearing as though we simply intend to replace one aggressive power with another. My father built his territory on fairness and restraint, even when that restraint ultimately cost him his life. I do not intend to abandon those principles now, simply because we have found ourselves in a position of greater strength. Cassian, seated at the edge of the council table, watched her navigate this delicate balance with the same quiet admiration that had grown steadily over the past several weeks. It was, he had come to understand, precisely the kind of leadership his own kingdom had been missing for years. A genuine consideration for the well-being of people, rather than simple accumulation of power for its own sake. That evening, as the council meeting concluded and most of the participants dispersed to their various responsibilities, Elena found herself once again in the garden she had cultivated with her own hands, seeking a few quiet moments of reflection after the intensity of the preceding days. Cassian found her there, his shoulder still bandaged from the battle's injuries, moving carefully as he settled onto the bench beside her. "You should still be resting," Elena observed, though there was less sharpness in the comment than there might have been weeks earlier. "I have rested enough," he said, "and I find I would rather spend this evening here, if you do not object to the company." Elena studied him for a long moment in the fading evening light, considering the man beside her against everything she had learned about him over the past several weeks. The careful, consistent effort, the genuine willingness to place himself in danger for her protection, the quiet humility with which he had approached every interaction since arriving at her territory the first time. "I do not object," she said finally, and something in her voice carried a warmth that had been carefully absent from their interactions for a very long time. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light of evening fade over the gardens, two people who had once been torn apart by pride and misunderstanding, now finding their way, slowly and carefully, back towards something that might yet become genuine partnership, built this time on honesty and mutual respect, rather than the fragile assumptions that had governed their original, brief time together. "I still have much to prove," Cassian said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. "I understand that today's actions do not erase what happened months ago in that great hall." "No," Elena agreed. "They do not erase it. But they matter, Cassian. What you did today, and everything you have done in the weeks since your first visit here, matters. I am not yet certain what that means for whatever remains between us, but I no longer view you the same way I did when you first arrived at my manor weeks ago." It was, Cassian understood, not a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was something genuine and meaningful, a small but significant step forward in a journey he had committed himself to, regardless of its ultimate outcome. "That is enough for now," he said quietly, "more than I believed I deserved when I first began this journey east weeks ago." Elena said nothing further, but as the evening deepened around them, she allowed herself, for the first time since the night of her rejection at Blackstone Keep, to consider seriously the possibility that whatever remained of the bond between them might yet grow into something worth embracing fully, rather than simply enduring, as an unavoidable consequence of fate's careless matching. What neither Elena nor Cassian yet knew, as they sat together in the quiet garden that evening, was that Alpha Garrick Thorn's retreat had not been a full surrender, but a tactical withdrawal, a decision to regroup and reconsider his approach, rather than abandon his ambitions entirely. Thorn had built his territory through 2 years of careful, ruthless calculation, and a single decisive defeat, however costly, was not enough to convince a man of his particular temperament to abandon everything he had worked to build. In his own stronghold, several days' ride to the north, Thorn gathered his most trusted advisors, his mood dark and calculating, rather than despairing. "The girl has grown more formidable than any of our intelligence suggested," said one advisor, a wiry, calculating wolf named Hugh Fenmore, who had served Thorn since the earliest days of his expansion. And the alliance with Blackstone Keep complicates any direct confrontation considerably. Their combined forces proved more coordinated than we anticipated. I am aware of the difficulties, Hugh, Thorne growled, pacing before the fire in his private chambers. I do not need them recited back to me. I need solutions. Hugh considered his next words carefully before speaking. Perhaps then, a direct confrontation is not the wisest path forward. The alliance between Elena Voss and Blackstone Keep is built on recent, still fragile trust. If that trust could be undermined, if suspicion could be sown between them regarding the true motivations behind their alliance, the coalition currently opposing us might fracture without requiring further costly military engagement. Thorne stopped his pacing, considering this suggestion with the calculating patience that had allowed him to expand his territory so successfully over the past 2 years, before this recent and humiliating setback. What do you propose? Alpha King Blackwood rejected Elena Voss publicly, before his entire kingdom, only months ago, Hugh said. Whatever alliance now exists between them was clearly built quickly, in the aftermath of that humiliation, likely driven as much by strategic necessity as by genuine trust. If we could plant doubt, suggest to Elena's council that Blackstone's support serves purposes beyond simple alliance, perhaps even suggest that Cassian intends to eventually reclaim control over the northern territories through his connection to her bloodline, rather than genuine partnership, the fragile trust between them might crack under the pressure of renewed suspicion. Thorne considered this strategy carefully, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his features for the first time since his forces had been pushed back from the contested border. See that it is done, Hugh, quietly, and with enough subtlety that the source cannot easily be traced back to us. If we cannot defeat this alliance through direct force, we will simply have to defeat it through more patient means. Far to the south, unaware of the careful scheme now being set into motion against them, Elena and Cassian continued their quiet evening in the garden, the fragile trust rebuilding between them, still entirely unaware of the challenge that was about to test its true strength. Hugh Fenmore's scheme unfolded carefully over the following 2 weeks, spread not through direct accusation, but through the far more effective method of carefully placed rumor, whispered among merchants and travelers who carried word between territories, without ever fully understanding the source or purpose behind what they repeated. The first version of the rumor reached Elena's manor through Grant Whitfield, who brought it to the council with visible discomfort, uncertain how seriously to treat information that felt, even to him, somewhat implausible. There is talk, in some of the border villages, that Blackstone's support was never truly about alliance, Grant reported carefully. Some claim that Cassian intends, once Thorne is fully defeated, to press his claim over the northern territories through the mate bond, arguing that as your mate, however complicated that bond's history, he holds legitimate right to co-rule alongside you, effectively absorbing the Voss bloodline's reclaimed territory into Blackstone's own growing influence. Elena listened to this report with careful, measured attention, understanding immediately the shape of the strategy, even before Edmund voiced the suspicion aloud. This has the mark of deliberate manipulation, Edmund said. Thorne, having failed through direct force, now attempts to fracture our alliance through suspicion instead. It is a classic strategy, one my old training under your father specifically prepared me to recognize. I am aware of the strategy, Elena said, though something uncomfortable stirred beneath her careful composure, despite her recognition of the manipulation at play. But awareness of a strategy does not automatically neutralize the doubt it seeks to plant. Cassian has given me every reason, over these past weeks, to trust his genuine intentions, and yet the history between you makes the accusation land with more weight than it perhaps deserves, Priscilla finished gently. Elena did not deny it. The rejection in that great hall, the humiliation she had carried and transformed into determined strength over the following weeks, remained a wound that had not fully healed, regardless of how much genuine effort Cassian had demonstrated since. A single carefully placed rumor, built on the foundation of that old wound, carried more power to unsettle her than it perhaps should have, given everything she had witnessed of his character in the weeks since. I will speak with him directly, Elena decided finally. If Thorne intends to fracture our alliance through doubt and suspicion, the only genuine defense is honesty, addressed directly, rather than allowed to fester beneath careful diplomatic silence. She sent word to Blackstone Keep that same evening, requesting Cassian's presence at her manor as soon as he was able to travel, uncertain herself whether the conversation ahead would strengthen the fragile trust they had been carefully rebuilding, or whether it would reveal a crack that Thorne's careful manipulation had simply been clever enough to find. Cassian arrived at Elena's manor 2 days later, having ridden through difficult weather to answer her summons as quickly as possible, sensing from the careful formality of her message that something significant had shifted since his last visit. He found her waiting in the same study where their earliest, most difficult conversations had taken place, her expression composed but guarded in a way that immediately concerned him. "Tell me honestly," Elena said, without preamble, once the door had closed behind him. "Do you intend, once Thorne is fully defeated, to press any claim over my reclaimed territory through the mate bond that connects us?" Cassian stared at her for a long moment, genuine surprise crossing his features, before understanding began to dawn. "Someone has suggested this to you." "Rumors have reached my council," Elena confirmed, suggesting that Blackstone's support was never truly about genuine alliance, but about eventual claim over territory that would otherwise remain entirely mine. "And you believed it enough to summon me here, rather than dismiss it outright?" Cassian asked, and there was something wounded beneath the question, though he worked to keep his voice steady. Elena held his gaze without flinching. "I believed it enough to want to hear your answer directly, rather than allow doubt to fester unaddressed. You once stood before your entire kingdom, and called me unworthy, Cassian. Forgive me if old wounds make certain doubts land with more weight than perhaps they should." The honesty of her words settled over him heavily, and rather than responding with immediate defensiveness, he took a moment to consider his answer carefully, understanding that how he responded now mattered more than almost anything he had said or done since arriving at her territory the first time. "I understand why that wound makes this doubt difficult to dismiss," he said finally. "And I will not simply demand you trust my denial without offering something more substantial. I have no claim, and I seek no claim, over your territory, your bloodline, or your authority. Whatever exists between us, whatever the mate bond continues to pull toward, I want it built entirely on your terms, as your equal, never as someone seeking to absorb what you have built into something that serves my own kingdom's expansion. If it would ease your doubt, I am willing to formalize that commitment in writing, witnessed by both our councils, making explicit that Blackstone Keep claims no authority whatsoever over Voss territory, regardless of whatever personal relationship may or may not develop between us." Elena studied him carefully, searching for any hint of calculation beneath the sincerity of his offer, and found none. "That will not be necessary," she said finally. "Your willingness to offer it so readily tells me what I needed to know." "Then who spread this rumor?" Cassian asked, his expression darkening with the realization that someone had deliberately sought to damage the trust they had worked so hard to rebuild. "Thorne, most likely," Elena said. "Having failed through direct force, he now attempts subtler methods to fracture what we have built together." Cassian's jaw tightened at this confirmation. Then he has made a significant error in judgment, if he believed a rumor alone would be enough to undo what genuine effort has built between us these past weeks. Elena allowed herself, for the first time since Grant's troubling report, a small, genuine smile. "It seems he has indeed underestimated us both." They spent the remainder of that evening not simply addressing the immediate threat of Thorne's continued manipulation, but discussing openly, for the first time, exactly what they hoped the future of their alliance, and perhaps something more personal, beyond simple alliance, might eventually become. It was not a full resolution, not yet, but it was a conversation built entirely on honesty, the kind of honesty that had been missing during their original, brief time together at Blackstone Keep, and that both of them now understood was essential, if whatever grew between them was ever going to prove lasting. News of Thorne's failed manipulation attempt spread quickly through both territories, and rather than achieving the fracture he had hoped for, the revelation of his scheme only strengthened the growing coalition against him. Several previously hesitant packs, hearing how Elena and Cassian had addressed the rumor directly and honestly, rather than allowing suspicion to fester, formally committed their support to the alliance, viewing the transparency as evidence of genuine, trustworthy leadership, rather than the calculating self-interest they had come to expect from Thorne's own rule. But if Thorne's scheme had failed to fracture the alliance, it had succeeded in revealing something else entirely, a new and more complicated challenge that neither Elena nor Cassian had fully anticipated. Word of Elena's growing influence, and of her apparent renewed connection to Blackstone's king, had begun attracting attention from other ambitious leaders across the region, some seeking genuine alliance, others seeing opportunity in the perceived vulnerability of a young leader whose personal life had become, however unfairly, a matter of regional speculation. Among these new arrivals was Alpha Grant Everly, a young and ambitious leader from a southern territory who had built a considerable reputation for both military strength and diplomatic cunning. He arrived at Elena's manor unannounced, ostensibly to offer alliance against the continued threat posed by Thorn, though his true motivations proved, almost immediately, to carry a more personal dimension. "Your reputation precedes you, Lady Voss," Everly said, during the formal reception arranged to discuss his proposed alliance. "A woman who rebuilt an entire legacy from nothing, who commands genuine loyalty from allies, and respect even from enemies. I confess, I find myself considerably more interested in forging a lasting partnership with you than the temporary military alliance my initial message suggested." Elena, seated at the head of her council table, recognized immediately the deeper implication behind his carefully chosen words. "I appreciate the offer of alliance against Thorn, Alpha Everly. I would ask, however, that we keep our discussions focused on the practical matters of shared military coordination, rather than personal considerations that have no bearing on our territory's mutual interests." Everly smiled, unbothered by the gentle deflection. "Of course, Lady Voss. Though I would be remiss, not to mention that a partnership built on more than simple military convenience often proves considerably more stable and lasting than alliances forged purely from shared enemies." Cassian, present at the meeting as Blackstone's representative, felt something sharp and unfamiliar tighten in his chest at the barely veiled suggestion, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, understanding that any visible reaction would only complicate an already delicate diplomatic situation. The meeting continued for another hour, discussing genuine matters of military coordination against Thorn's continued threat, but Everly's interest in Elena remained a persistent undercurrent throughout the discussion, evident in the careful attention he paid to her opinions, the subtle compliments woven into otherwise professional exchanges, the lingering glances that made his intentions clear to everyone present, whether or not they chose to acknowledge them openly. That evening, after Everly had retired to the guest quarters arranged for his visit, Cassian found himself walking the manor's gardens alone, working through the unfamiliar and uncomfortable feelings that had surfaced during the day's discussions. "You seem troubled," Priscilla observed, finding him there during her own evening walk through the grounds she maintained with careful attention. "I have no right to feel troubled by anything regarding Elena's interactions with potential allies," Cassian said, more to himself than to Priscilla, though he did not deny the accuracy of her observation. "I forfeited that right months ago, in a great hall filled with witnesses to my own foolishness." Priscilla studied him for a long moment, something thoughtful in her expression. "Rights are not always the relevant question, Your Majesty. Feelings exist regardless of whether we believe we have earned the right to hold them. The more important question is what you intend to do with what you are feeling." "What would you suggest?" Cassian asked, genuinely curious despite the discomfort of the conversation. "I would suggest," Priscilla said carefully, "that jealousy expressed through demand or possessiveness serves no one well, particularly given the history between you and Elena. But honesty about your feelings, offered without expectation or pressure, might serve you considerably better than silent brooding through her territory's gardens." Cassian considered this advice carefully over the following days, watching with growing discomfort as Everly's attention toward Elena continued, subtle but persistent, throughout the ongoing military coordination discussions. He said nothing directly about his feelings, mindful of Elena's earlier insistence that whatever developed between them needed to happen on her terms, without pressure from his side of the bond. But Elena, for her part, noticed his careful restraint, and found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, paying closer attention to how he handled the situation than she might have expected. "You have said nothing about Everly's interest," she observed one evening, finding Cassian alone, in the same garden where Priscilla had found him days earlier. "It is not my place to say anything," Cassian replied carefully. "You are free to consider alliance, or anything beyond alliance, with whoever you believe serves your territory and your own well-being best. I forfeited any claim to influence that decision months ago." Elena studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her careful expression. That is either remarkably mature restraint, or a rather convenient excuse to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. Cassian met her gaze directly, something raw and honest surfacing beneath his careful composure. Perhaps it is both. I will admit, Elena, that watching Everly's attention toward you these past days has been considerably more difficult than I expected. But I made a promise, when I first arrived at your territory weeks ago, that whatever happened between us would happen on your terms, without pressure. I intend to keep that promise, even when keeping it proves difficult. Elena said nothing immediately, absorbing the honesty of his admission with careful consideration. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a warmth that had been growing steadily over the past several weeks, though it remained tempered by her characteristic caution. For what it is worth, she said, Alpha Everly's interest, while flattering in its own way, holds little genuine appeal for me. I have spent 2 years building something entirely my own, and I have little patience for a partner who sees that accomplishment primarily as an attractive quality to be pursued, rather than a genuine achievement to be respected. And what does hold genuine appeal for you? Cassian asked, before he could fully consider whether the question was wise to voice aloud. Elena considered her answer carefully, watching him with an expression that had, over the past several weeks, gradually shed much of its careful guardedness. Someone who has demonstrated, through consistent effort rather than convenient words, genuine respect for who I am and what I have built. Someone willing to place himself in danger to protect me, not out of possessiveness, but out of genuine care. Someone who, even when jealousy might justify a less restrained response, chooses instead to honor the boundaries I have asked him to respect. The implication of her words settled over Cassian slowly, and something in his chest loosened for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Elena, he said quietly, are you saying what I believe you are saying? I am saying, Elena replied, her voice steady, despite the vulnerability evident beneath it, that the time and space I asked for weeks ago has served its purpose. I have watched you, carefully and thoroughly, and I believe, now, that the man standing before me is genuinely different from the one who wronged me in that great hall. I am not yet certain what that means for the future, but I am no longer uncertain about whether the effort you have shown these past weeks was genuine. Cassian stepped closer, careful and deliberate, giving her every opportunity to step away if his proximity became unwelcome. When she did not step away, something settled between them, fragile but genuine, the first true acknowledgement of the reconciliation that had been building quietly, through careful effort and honest conversation, over the many weeks since his first difficult arrival at her territory. Thank you, he said quietly, for giving me the chance to prove that. Do not thank me yet, Elena said, though there was warmth beneath the careful words. There is still considerable work ahead, for both of us, and for our territories, before we can fully consider what comes next between us personally. But I am willing, now, to walk that path alongside you, rather than simply watching from a careful distance. It was not, either of them understood, a complete resolution of everything that had happened between them. The wound from that great hall rejection remained, a scar that would take considerable time to fully heal, but it was a genuine step forward, built this time on honesty and mutual respect, towards something that might yet become the partnership fate had originally intended for them, before pride and fear had torn it apart months earlier. News of the growing closeness between Elena and Cassian did not remain private for long, spreading quickly through the manor's staff and, inevitably, reaching Alpha Everly's attention before his diplomatic visit concluded. He took the development with more grace than either Elena or Cassian expected, approaching Elena directly on the final evening of his stay. I understand my hopes for a more personal alliance were perhaps always somewhat unrealistic, Everly said, finding her alone in the manor's main hall as preparations for his departure were finalized. Blackstone's king has made his continued devotion rather clear these past weeks, even through his careful restraint. I hope this does not affect our territory's continued military cooperation against Thorn, Elena said carefully, unwilling to let personal matters compromise the broader alliance still critical to the region's stability. Not at all, Everly assured her, with genuine sincerity beneath his earlier disappointment. I may have hoped for something more personal, Lady Voss, but I respect genuine partnership when I witness it. Whatever grows between you and King Blackwood, it is clearly built on something real, something I would be foolish to interfere with, simply out of my own disappointed ambition. He departed the following morning with his diplomatic mission successfully concluded, formal alliance secured against Thorne's continued threat, and though his personal hopes had gone unfulfilled, he left with genuine respect for the leader he had come to court, and the king who had, through patient restraint, earned her renewed trust. As his escort disappeared down the southern road, Elena found herself standing beside Cassian on the manor's front steps, watching the departure with a quiet sense of relief that the complicated diplomatic tension of the past week had resolved without lasting damage to either the broader alliance or the fragile personal reconciliation still carefully rebuilding between them. One threat addressed, Cassian observed, though Thorne himself remains, considerably weakened, but not yet fully defeated. Then we continue the work ahead, Elena said, together, as we have these past several weeks. She glanced at him sideways, something warm and genuine in her expression that had been entirely absent during his first difficult arrival at her territory months earlier. Together, she repeated, testing the word's new weight, and finding, to her own quiet satisfaction, that it fit considerably more comfortably than she might have expected, given everything that had happened between them before this long, careful road toward reconciliation had finally begun to show its true destination. In the weeks that followed Everly's departure, the relationship between Elena and Cassian continued deepening, though both remained careful not to let personal matters overshadow the considerable work still required to fully secure the northern territories against Thorne's lingering threat. Cassian divided his time between Blackstone Keep and Elena's manor, managing his own kingdom's affairs while continuing to support the alliance that had grown into something far more significant than either of them had originally anticipated. During one such visit, as autumn settled over the eastern hills and the gardens Elena had cultivated began their seasonal transition toward winter, she found herself sharing something she had not spoken of since the earliest days of her secret rebuilding. "My father used to walk these hills," she said, as they walked together, along a quiet path, overlooking the territory she had reclaimed. Not these exact hills, of course. Our original territory lies further north, still partially under Thorne's control. But hills much like these, where he would take me as a child, teaching me about the plants, the seasons, the patient work of building something lasting, rather than simply seizing what could be taken by force. Cassian listened carefully, understanding the significance of her willingness to share this memory, a piece of her history she had guarded closely through 2 years of careful concealment. "He sounds like he was a good man," Cassian said quietly, "and a wise leader." "He was," Elena agreed, a note of old grief still evident beneath her steady voice. "Perhaps too gentle for the world he governed, in the end. His restraint, his unwillingness to strike first, even when threat was clearly gathering, ultimately cost him his life. I have spent 2 years wondering whether I honor his memory better by following his example of patient fairness, or by learning from what that fairness ultimately cost him. Perhaps both are possible," Cassian offered carefully. "I have watched you these past months, Elena. You have shown remarkable fairness in how you govern, the same patient consideration your father valued, but you have also shown a willingness to act decisively when genuine threat demands it, as you did against Thorne's forces at the border. Perhaps that balance, fairness tempered by decisive strength when necessary, is exactly the legacy your father would have wanted you to carry forward." Elena considered his words carefully, something easing in her expression as she absorbed them. "That is, perhaps, exactly what I needed to hear." They continued their walk in comfortable silence, and as the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and violet, Elena found herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, genuinely content with where her carefully constructed path had ultimately led her. There was still work ahead, still the lingering threat of Thorne's wounded but not fully defeated ambition, still the complicated work of fully rebuilding the trust that had been broken so completely months earlier, in a great hall filled with witnesses. But walking beside Cassian through the gardens she had built with her own hands, Elena allowed herself, cautiously and deliberately, to hope that whatever remained ahead might finally be walked together, rather than carried alone. Alpha Garrick Thorne's second attempt at destroying the alliance between Elena and Cassian came not through rumor or manipulation, but through the kind of desperate, reckless force that men resort to when every careful strategy has already failed them. Having lost the battle at the border and failed to fracture the alliance through Hugh Fenmore's careful scheming, Thorne understood, with growing bitterness, that his window for reclaiming his previous dominance over the northern territories was rapidly closing. Reports reached Elena's manor on a cold winter morning, carried by an exhausted rider who had traveled through the night to deliver news of Thorne's final, desperate gambit. "He has taken hostages," Felix reported, his voice tight, with barely controlled anger as he relayed the details to the assembled council. "A small village near the contested border, one that recently pledged formal alliance to your cause. Thorne's forces overran it 3 days ago, and he is holding the villagers, demanding your personal surrender in exchange for their safe release." Elena absorbed this news with a stillness that belied the fury building beneath her careful composure. "How many hostages?" "Nearly 200, including children," Felix confirmed. "Thorne has stated clearly that any attempt at military rescue will result in immediate consequences for the hostages. He wants you, personally, delivered to his stronghold within 5 days, or he claims the village will suffer the full consequences of what he calls your continued defiance." The council chamber fell into tense silence as the weight of this ultimatum settled over everyone present. Edmund was the first to speak, his voice carrying the careful, measured tone of someone who understood exactly how dangerous the situation had become. "This is not a genuine negotiation," Edmund said. "Thorne has no intention of releasing those hostages safely, regardless of whether you surrender yourself. This is a trap, designed to eliminate you personally, while using innocent lives as leverage to ensure you walk directly into it." "I am aware of that," Elena said, her voice steady despite the visible tension in her posture, "but I cannot simply abandon nearly 200 innocent people to whatever consequences Thorne intends to inflict, regardless of his true motivations." Cassian, who had arrived at the manor only hours before the news broke, stepped forward with the same fierce determination he had shown during the earlier battle at the border. "There must be another option beyond simple surrender, or abandoning the hostages entirely." "There is," Elena said, already turning her attention toward the map spread across the council table, her mind working through the possibilities with the same careful strategic thinking that had guided her through every previous crisis of the past 2 years. "A rescue operation, carefully planned and executed with enough precision to free the hostages before Thorne can act on his threats, while simultaneously addressing his continued ambition once and for all. That is considerably more dangerous than simple surrender," Priscilla pointed out carefully. "If the operation fails, if Thorne discovers our forces moving before the rescue can be completed, the consequences for the hostages could be immediate and severe." "I am aware of the risk," Elena said, "but I refuse to accept that surrendering myself into Thorne's hands offers any genuine guarantee of the hostages' safety either. A man capable of taking innocent villagers hostage as leverage is not a man who honors agreements once his true objective has been achieved." The council spent the remainder of that day, and long into the night, developing a careful, detailed plan for the rescue operation, drawing on the combined military knowledge of both Elena's forces and Blackstone's contributed strength. Nathaniel Gray, who had traveled from Blackstone Keep specifically to assist with strategic planning, proved invaluable in identifying the tactical vulnerabilities in Thorne's stronghold that a carefully executed rescue might exploit. "His forces remain considerably weakened from the earlier defeat at the border," Nathaniel explained, tracing potential approach routes across the detailed map of Thorne's territory. "If we move with sufficient stealth and precision, striking simultaneously at the point where the hostages are held while creating a diversion elsewhere in his stronghold, we may be able to free them before he has any opportunity to act on his threats." The plan that emerged from these careful discussions was complex and demanding, requiring precise coordination between multiple teams moving simultaneously under cover of darkness, timed to strike during the narrow window when Thorne's remaining forces would be least prepared to respond effectively. Cassian insisted on leading one of the primary assault teams himself, a decision that Elena initially resisted, before ultimately accepting, understanding the genuine value his experience and skill offered to the operation's success. "You do not have to prove anything further to me," she said quietly, finding him alone, reviewing tactical details late into the night, before the operation was set to begin. "You have already shown, more than once, the depth of your commitment. This is not about proving anything to you. Cassian said, though something in his expression suggested her words had touched him nonetheless. This is about doing what is right, regardless of what it proves, or does not prove about my character. Nearly 200 innocent people are counting on this operation succeeding. That matters more than anything else right now. Elena studied him for a long moment, something warm and fierce moving behind her careful expression. Then let us ensure it succeeds. The rescue operation launched 2 nights later, under cover of a moonless sky that provided crucial concealment for the carefully coordinated teams moving into position around Thorn's stronghold. Elena led the primary infiltration team herself, moving with the same trained precision she had demonstrated during the earlier border battle, while Cassian's team created the necessary diversion at the stronghold's eastern defenses, drawing Thorn's remaining forces away from the section where the hostages were being held. The operation unfolded with tense, careful precision through the early hours of the night. Elena's team moved through the stronghold's shadows with practiced stealth, neutralizing the guards stationed near the hostages' holding area before they could raise any alarm. The hostages, frightened but largely unharmed, were guided quickly and quietly toward the escape route that had been carefully planned in advance. It was as the final group of hostages was being led to safety that the operation's careful precision finally broke down, when a young guard, more alert than his companions, spotted movement near the holding area and raised the alarm that Thorn's forces had been specifically working to prevent. What followed was chaotic and dangerous, as Thorn's remaining forces, alerted to the rescue operation underway, scrambled to respond, even as Elena's team worked desperately to complete the evacuation before reinforcements could arrive. Cassian, hearing the alarm from his position at the eastern diversion, immediately redirected his own forces to provide covering support, understanding that the operation's success now depended on speed and decisive action, rather than the careful stealth that had guided its initial stages. Thorn himself, alerted to the rescue underway, emerged to personally confront the escaping hostages and their rescuers, his massive gray form cutting through the chaos with the ruthless determination of a man watching his final desperate gambit collapse before his eyes. "You will not escape with what is mine," Thorn snarled, moving directly to intercept Elena as she guided the last of the hostages toward the escape route. "They were never yours," Elena replied, positioning herself between Thorn and the fleeing villagers with fierce, unwavering resolve. "Just as my father's territory was never rightfully yours, regardless of how many years you spent believing otherwise." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive, Elena drawing on every ounce of the training she had built over 2 years of careful, secret preparation, meeting Thorn's desperate, reckless attacks with controlled precision that spoke of genuine mastery rather than simple survival instinct. Cassian arrived moments later, having fought his way through Thorn's scrambling forces to reach the confrontation, adding his own strength to the fight against the man who had caused so much suffering across the northern territories. Together, they proved more than Thorn's weakened and demoralized forces could overcome. The Alpha who had ruled through fear and ruthless expansion for 2 years finally fell, defeated decisively by the combined strength of an alliance he had underestimated at every turn, from its careful, patient beginning through its fierce, determined conclusion. As dawn broke over the northern hills, the rescued hostages, exhausted but safe, were guided to safety, and word began spreading quickly through the region that Alpha Garrick Thorn's reign of aggressive expansion had finally, decisively, come to an end. Elena stood amid the aftermath of the operation, watching the last of the freed villagers reunite with loved ones who had traveled to meet them at the agreed rendezvous point, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that felt genuinely like the completion of a journey she had begun on that rain-soaked battlefield where her father had fallen. Cassian found her there, tired and battle-worn but unmistakably at peace, and settled beside her without immediately speaking, simply offering the quiet comfort of his presence as she absorbed the full weight of what had finally been accomplished. "It is done," she said finally, her voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and quiet triumph. 2 years of careful work, and it is finally, truly done. "Not entirely done," Cassian said gently. "There is still the work of formally reclaiming and rebuilding the northern territories, still the ongoing responsibility of leading everyone who has pledged loyalty to your cause. But the threat that has haunted you these past 2 years, the man responsible for your father's death, is finally defeated." Elena turned to look at him, something soft and genuine in her exhausted expression. I could not have accomplished this alone. Whatever doubts I carried, whatever careful distance I maintained, you have proven yourself, Cassian, beyond any doubt that remained. We accomplished this together, Cassian corrected gently, as I hope we will continue accomplishing whatever comes next, together, if that is still what you want. Elena studied him for a long moment, considering the journey that had brought them to this moment, from that humiliating rejection in a great hall filled with witnesses, through weeks of careful rebuilding trust, to this exhausted, triumphant dawn, following the defeat of an enemy who had haunted her for 2 long years. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady with genuine certainty. That is still what I want. As the sun rose fully over the northern hills, casting warm light across a territory finally free from the shadow of Thorn's ambition, Elena Voss and Cassian Blackwood stood together, no longer simply allies bound by strategic necessity, but partners who had proven, through genuine effort and shared sacrifice, that whatever fate had originally intended for their mate bond, they had finally found their way toward honoring it fully, on terms built entirely on mutual respect and hard-earned trust. In the days following Thorn's defeat, the full scope of what had been accomplished began settling over the northern territories. Word spread quickly, carried by grateful villagers and relieved allied packs, that the man who had ruled through fear and aggressive expansion for 2 years had finally been decisively removed from power, his remaining forces scattered, and his once formidable stronghold left without clear leadership. Elena, understanding the importance of moving quickly to prevent the resulting power vacuum from creating further instability, called an emergency council meeting within days of the rescue operation's success, bringing together not only her own advisors and Blackstone's representatives, but delegates from every allied territory that had contributed to the coalition against Thorn. The northern territories that Thorn controlled through force must now be carefully reintegrated, Elena told the assembled delegates, standing before a map that had grown considerably more complex over the past several months of conflict and negotiation. Not through the same aggressive expansion that characterized his rule, but through the patient, fair governance my father once practiced, and that I have worked these past 2 years to rebuild. The delegates listened with evident respect, many of them having witnessed firsthand, through the recent rescue operation and the broader conflict against Thorn, exactly how thoroughly Elena had earned the trust and loyalty that now supported her claim over the reclaimed northern territories. There will be challenges ahead, Edmund cautioned, addressing the assembled group with the careful wisdom that had guided Elena's counsel through 2 years of patient rebuilding. Some of Thorn's former allies may resist the transition to new leadership. Some territories may require considerable support to recover from the aggressive taxation and military demands he imposed during his rule. This will not be a simple or quick process. No, Elena agreed. But it will be a fair one, built on genuine consideration for the well-being of everyone within these territories, rather than simple accumulation of power. That is the legacy my father intended to leave, and it is the legacy I intend to honor, now that the immediate threat to achieving it has finally been removed. Cassian, seated among the assembled delegates as Blackstone's representative, watched Elena address the gathered leaders with quiet pride, understanding that he was witnessing the true completion of a journey that had begun long before he ever met her, shaped by grief and determination, and 2 years of careful, patient rebuilding that had finally found its full and proper conclusion. The council meeting stretched long into the following days, addressing the countless practical details required to fully reintegrate the reclaimed northern territories under Elena's rightful leadership. Through it all, Cassian remained a steady, supportive presence, offering Blackstone's continued resources and diplomatic support, without ever attempting to claim authority or influence beyond what Elena genuinely welcomed from him. It was during a quiet moment between council sessions, as the last details of the transition plan were being finalized, that Elena found herself reflecting on how far the journey had brought her, from a grieving 17-year-old girl hiding her identity on a distant hillside, to a leader finally standing at the full completion of everything she had worked so patiently to rebuild. Your father would be proud, Priscilla said gently, finding Elena alone in quiet reflection during a brief pause in the ongoing negotiations. Everything you have built, everything you have accomplished these past 2 years, it honors his memory more fully than simple grief ever could have. Elena nodded slowly, feeling the truth of those words settle over her with a mixture of grief and genuine peace. I hope so, Priscilla. I have carried his memory through every difficult decision these past 2 years. I hope, now that the immediate threat has finally passed, that I can honor him not simply through the reclamation of his territory, but through the fair, patient leadership he always modeled for me. As the council's work continued toward its eventual completion, and the Northern Territories began their careful transition toward stable, fair governance under Elena's rightful leadership, both she and Cassian understood that the most significant chapter of their shared journey, the defeat of Thorn and the reclamation of the Voss bloodline's legacy, had finally reached its conclusion. But another chapter, the quieter, more personal story of what they might yet build together, remained still unwritten, waiting for its own careful, deliberate beginning in the days and months ahead. Word of Elena's victory and the full revelation of her identity eventually reached every corner of the wider region, carried through the natural channels of trade and travel that connected even the most distant territories. The story that emerged, of a grieving daughter who had rebuilt her father's legacy from nothing, who had defeated the man responsible for his death through patient strategy and genuine courage, captured the imagination of packs and territories far beyond the immediate northern conflict. Among those who took particular interest in this remarkable turn of events were the advisors back at Blackstone Keep, who had spent months watching their king's careful, consistent effort to prove himself worthy of reconciliation with a woman they had once dismissed as unworthy of his attention. Louisa Fenwick, who had questioned Cassian's judgment most directly during the early council debates about supporting Elena's cause, found herself reconsidering her earlier skepticism as reports of the successful rescue operation and Thorn's decisive defeat reached the keep. I confess, she admitted during a council meeting convened to discuss the ongoing implications of the Northern conflict's resolution, I did not fully appreciate the significance of what our king recognized in Lady Voss when he first proposed this alliance months ago. Watching how this conflict has unfolded, I believe history will remember this as one of the wisest strategic decisions of his reign. Nathaniel Gray, who had traveled extensively between Blackstone Keep and Elena's territory over the preceding months, nodded in agreement. It is more than simple strategic wisdom, if I may say so. I have watched our king's genuine transformation these past months, from a leader who once allowed narrow advisors to shape his judgment, to someone who has learned, through considerable personal cost, exactly what genuine partnership and respect actually require. The council's growing respect for the alliance with Elena's territory reflected a broader shift that had taken hold throughout Blackstone Keep over the preceding months, as reports of Cassian's consistent support, his willingness to place himself in danger during the border battle and the subsequent rescue operation, and his careful respect for Elena's authority and independence, gradually reshaped the kingdom's understanding of what genuine strength in leadership actually looked like. Back in the Northern Territories, as the careful work of reintegration and rebuilding continued through the following weeks, Elena found herself increasingly recognized not simply as the daughter of a fallen alpha reclaiming her birthright, but as a formidable leader in her own right, whose judgment and strength had proven themselves through genuine trial rather than simple inherited authority. It was during a formal ceremony held to mark the official transition of the reclaimed Northern Territories under her leadership, attended by delegates from every allied territory that had contributed to the coalition against Thorn, that Elena stood before the assembled crowd and spoke words that echoed, in their quiet dignity, the very rejection ceremony that had once been used to humiliate her. Months ago, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered assembly, I stood in a great hall and was told, before witnesses, that I was unworthy of a king's attention, unworthy of respect, unworthy of standing beside someone with genuine strength and authority. I want every person gathered here today, and every person who hears of this ceremony in the days and months to come, to understand exactly how wrong that judgment proved to be. The crowd listened in respectful, attentive silence as she continued, her words carrying the weight of 2 years of patient struggle finally reaching their proper conclusion. I did not rebuild what you see before you today, through anyone's permission or approval. I rebuilt it through patience, through careful strategy, through the genuine loyalty of allies who believed in fair leadership over simple accumulation of power. And I stand here today not simply to reclaim what was taken from my family, but to demonstrate, clearly and unmistakably, that worth is never determined by another person's narrow judgment. It is determined by what we choose to build and how we choose to treat those who depend on our leadership. The assembled crowd erupted into genuine heartfelt applause, and among those gathered, Cassian watched with quiet pride and something deeper, a genuine admiration for the woman who had transformed her own humiliation into the foundation of a legacy that would clearly outlast any single moment of cruelty inflicted upon her. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, Elena found a quiet moment to step away from the festivities, seeking a brief respite in the gardens that had become, over the preceding months, a place of genuine peace and reflection for her. Cassian found her there, as he so often did during these quiet moments, and settled beside her without immediately speaking, simply offering the comfortable presence that had become, over their months of careful rebuilding, a genuine source of steady comfort for them both. "Your speech was remarkable," he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I do not believe I have ever witnessed anyone transform genuine humiliation into something so powerful and so genuinely inspiring." Elena turned to look at him, something warm and genuine in her expression. "I could not have reached this moment without everything that came before it, Cassian, including, strange as it may sound, the very rejection that once caused me so much pain. It forced me to fully become who I was always meant to be, rather than remaining someone quietly hoping for approval that was never truly mine to seek." "I am grateful," Cassian said quietly, "that whatever pain I caused ultimately led you toward becoming this remarkable version of yourself, though I will always regret that I was the one who caused that pain in the first place." "Regret is useful," Elena said gently, "for exactly as long as it takes to understand what it is trying to teach you. I believe you learned that lesson thoroughly, Cassian, through everything you have shown me these past months. It is time, I think, to let the regret finally rest, and to focus instead on whatever we choose to build together, going forward." As the celebration continued in the distance, its warm light and joyful sounds carrying faintly across the quiet garden, Elena and Cassian sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had traveled a long and difficult road from humiliation and rejection toward genuine partnership, finally arriving at a place where the future ahead of them felt, for the first time in a very long while, genuinely bright with possibility. Winter gave way slowly to spring across the northern territories, and with the changing season came the steady, visible signs of genuine recovery and growth throughout the lands that had once suffered under Thorn's aggressive rule. Villages that had lived under fear and heavy taxation now flourished under the fair governance Elena had promised, their prosperity growing with each passing month, as trust in her leadership deepened through consistent, genuine care for their well-being. Cassian divided his time increasingly between Blackstone Keep and Elena's territory, though the careful diplomatic language once used to describe his frequent visits had gradually given way, among both councils, to simple acknowledgement of what had clearly become a genuine and deepening partnership between their two territories, and between the two leaders who governed them. It was during one such visit, on a warm spring evening as the gardens Elena had cultivated bloomed fully into their seasonal glory, that Cassian requested a private audience with her, his manner carrying a formality that immediately caught her attention. "You seem unusually serious this evening," Elena observed, settling across from him in the same study where their earliest, most difficult conversations had taken place, now transformed by the warmth that had grown steadily between them over the preceding months. "I have been considering something for quite some time," Cassian said, and there was a nervousness in his voice that Elena had rarely witnessed from the man who had once commanded an entire kingdom with unshakable confidence. "I would like your permission to speak with your council, formally, regarding my intentions going forward." Elena studied him with careful curiosity, though something in his manner suggested she already understood, at least in general terms, where this conversation was heading. "What intentions exactly?" Cassian took a steadying breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a sincerity that reached back to their very first difficult conversation, months earlier, when he had first arrived at her territory, seeking forgiveness he had not been certain he deserved. "Months ago, I stood before my entire kingdom and rejected you, publicly and cruelly, without ever truly understanding who you were, or what strength you carried. I have spent every day, since that terrible night, working to become someone worthy of the trust you have gradually, carefully extended to me. I do not believe that work is ever truly finished, Elena. I believe becoming a good partner, a genuine equal, is something that requires constant effort, for as long as we both choose to walk that path together. He paused, gathering himself before continuing, and Elena found herself holding perfectly still, understanding the significance of what was clearly building toward its conclusion. I love you, Cassian said finally, the words carrying a weight and sincerity that bore no resemblance to the careless, prideful man who had once stood before his kingdom and called her unworthy. Not because of the mate bond that first connected us, though I am grateful for whatever fate brought us together. I love you because of who you have shown yourself to be, through every difficult trial these past months. Your patience, your fairness, your fierce strength when strength was needed, your genuine care for the people who depend on your leadership. I would like, if you are willing, to formally ask for your hand, not as a king seeking strategic advantage, but as a man who has learned, through considerable personal cost, exactly what genuine partnership requires. Elena sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of his words, her mind traveling back through the entire journey that had brought them to this moment, from the humiliation of that great hall rejection, through the careful, patient rebuilding of trust, to this warm spring evening, filled with genuine hope rather than uncertain doubt. You once told me, she said finally, her voice carrying quiet emotion beneath its steady composure, that watching me these past months had taught you more about genuine leadership than years at Blackstone Keep ever had. I want you to know, Cassian, that watching your transformation these past months has taught me something equally important. That people are capable of genuine change when they are willing to face their own failures honestly and commit to becoming better, not simply for the sake of winning back what was lost, but because they genuinely believe in the value of that growth. She reached across the space between them, taking his hand with a gentleness that carried the full weight of everything they had built together over the preceding months. Yes, she said simply, I am willing. The formal announcement of their engagement, made before both councils in a joint ceremony held several weeks later, was met with genuine celebration throughout both territories, a stark and welcome contrast to the humiliating rejection ceremony that had once threatened to define their entire story. Delegates from allied territories across the region traveled considerable distances to attend, eager to witness the formal union of two leaders whose combined strength and wisdom had already reshaped the balance of power throughout the northern lands. Damon Ashcroft, who had witnessed the entire journey from that first difficult night of rejection through every subsequent trial and triumph, found himself reflecting on the remarkable transformation he had observed in his king over the preceding months. I confess, he told Cassian privately, in the quiet moments before the formal ceremony began, there were nights, in the weeks following Elena's disappearance, when I feared you might never recover from the mistake you had made. I am grateful, more than I can properly express, to witness how thoroughly you have proven that fear unfounded. I could not have found my way back without the patience of everyone who supported me through those difficult months, Cassian said, including you, Damon, more than you perhaps realize. Your honesty, that first difficult conversation about what genuine strength actually means, set me on the path that eventually led me here. The wedding ceremony itself, held in the gardens Elena had cultivated with her own hands over the preceding 2 years, carried a quiet, genuine beauty that reflected everything the relationship between Elena and Cassian had become, built not on the careless assumptions of fate's mate bond, but on genuine, hard-earned trust and mutual respect. Edmund Cole, who had served Elena's family loyally through the darkest days following her father's death, spoke briefly during the ceremony, his voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion as he addressed the assembled crowd. I have served the Voss bloodline for many years, he said, through prosperity and through devastating loss. I have watched Elena grow from a grieving girl, forced to hide her true identity, into a leader whose strength and wisdom now stand as an example for territories far beyond her own. Today, as she formally unites her legacy with that of Blackstone Keep, I am reminded of something her father once told me, many years ago, about the nature of genuine partnership. He paused, looking toward Elena with evident affection before continuing. Julian Voss believed that true strength was never found in standing alone, but in choosing carefully who to stand beside, and building something together that neither partner could have achieved independently. I believe, watching what Elena and Cassian have built together these past months, that he would recognize exactly that quality in the partnership we celebrate here today. As the ceremony concluded, and the celebration stretched long into the warm spring evening, Elena found herself standing beside Cassian, watching the assembled guests from both territories mingle together in genuine, joyful celebration, and felt, with quiet certainty, that she had finally arrived at the true completion of the long journey that had begun on that rain-soaked battlefield, 2 years, and what felt like a lifetime ago. "Do you have any regrets?" Cassian asked quietly, finding a private moment amid the celebration to stand beside her, watching the gathered guests with the same quiet contentment she felt herself. Elena considered the question seriously, as she considered most things, before answering with genuine honesty. "I regret the pain of losing my father, and the 2 years of hiding that grief demanded of me. I regret the humiliation of that rejection ceremony, though I understand now that it forced me to fully become who I was always meant to be. But no, Cassian, I do not regret the journey that ultimately led me here, to this moment, standing beside someone who has proven, through genuine trial and genuine growth, exactly what fate's original bond between us was always meant to become." Cassian took her hand, watching the last light of the spring evening fade over the gardens they now shared, and felt, for the first time since that terrible night in the Great Hall so many months earlier, that the hollow ache which had once haunted him constantly had finally, fully, been replaced by something genuine and lasting. "Then let us build whatever comes next together," he said quietly, "with the same patience and genuine care that brought us here." "Together," Elena agreed, and the word carried none of the uncertainty it once had, months earlier, when she had first tested its weight in the aftermath of Thorn's defeat. It carried instead the quiet, unshakable certainty of two people who had faced humiliation, war, and genuine hardship, and had emerged from it all not simply intact, but genuinely stronger, bound together by trust that had been earned rather than assumed. As the celebration continued around them, and the Northern Territories settled into the peaceful prosperity that Elena's patient leadership had made possible, the story that had begun with a king's cruel rejection and a woman's cold, unbreakable smile finally reached its true conclusion, not in bitterness or lasting division, but in genuine partnership, hard-earned and deeply deserved by two people who had each, in their own difficult way, learned exactly what strength and worthiness truly meant. And in the quiet years that followed, as their combined territories flourished under fair, patient leadership, and as the memory of that humiliating rejection ceremony gradually transformed into nothing more than the difficult first chapter of a much longer and ultimately triumphant story, both Elena and Cassian understood, with the clarity that only genuine hardship and genuine growth can provide, that the truest measure of any partnership was never found in how it began, but in how thoroughly both people were willing to work, honestly and patiently, toward becoming worthy of what they hoped it might eventually become. In the years that followed their union, Elena and Cassian built something that neither of their two territories had ever quite seen before, a partnership of equals that governed not through the simple accumulation of shared power, but through genuine collaboration, each drawing on the other's particular strengths to build something more thoughtful and lasting than either might have achieved alone. Elena continued to govern her reclaimed northern territories with the same fair, patient wisdom that had defined her leadership since the earliest days of reclaiming her father's legacy, while Cassian, transformed by everything he had learned through the painful process of earning back her trust, brought similar changes to his own governance of Blackstone Keep, gradually reshaping his council to value genuine wisdom over narrow strategic calculation. Priscilla Vane, who had served Elena faithfully since the earliest days of her secret rebuilding, often remarked, in later years, that the true measure of Elena's victory was not simply the defeat of Thorn or the reclamation of her father's territory, but the quiet, steady example she had set for every young leader who came after her, proof that genuine strength could be built through patience and fairness rather than fear and aggressive expansion. Felix Marlowe, who had grown from an eager young wolf into one of Elena's most trusted advisors, eventually took on responsibility for training the next generation of scouts and strategists, teaching them not simply the tactical skills that had proven so crucial during the conflict with Thorn, but the deeper values of loyalty and genuine care that Elena had modeled throughout her remarkable journey. And on quiet evenings, when the pressing responsibilities of governing two flourishing territories allowed for a few peaceful hours together, Elena and Cassian could often be found in the gardens she had first cultivated with her own hands, 2 years before fate brought them together, through a bond neither of them had originally chosen, but that both had ultimately learned to honor fully, through genuine effort, genuine humility, and the hard-earned understanding that true partnership is never simply given, but built, patiently and deliberately, through every difficult season that tests its lasting strength. The cold smile that Elena had once offered Cassian in that humiliating great hall, the smile that had first revealed to him exactly how thoroughly he had misjudged her, remained, in the years that followed, a story told throughout both territories, not as a symbol of lasting bitterness, but as the defining moment when a woman who had been told she was unworthy chose instead to prove, through patient strength and unshakable resolve, that her worth had never depended on anyone else's judgment to begin with. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of legacy her father would have been proud to see her build, and exactly the kind of partnership that fate, however carelessly it had first brought them together, had always intended for two people strong enough to eventually find their way back to each other, on terms built entirely on genuine, hard-earned trust.